My heart is bleeding. I don't want to leave my home, but it's my duty to keep my children safe. When we will win the war, I'll take them back home.
Grandad Oleg hugs his wife Olena, but he must stay behind to care for an elderly relative. The women carry the burdens of exile. The family reached Lviv 8 hours later. But they've already caught another rescue train. West to peace and exile. Fergal Keane, BBC News, Lviv.
Plenty more coming up on BBC News at the top of the hour. You can also reach me on Twitter. I'm at BBC Mariam. You're watching BBC News. Stay with us.
Hello there. Let's take a look at some of the big weather stories going on across the globe, which have been affecting areas from Florida up towards the Canadian Maritimes. Now, a ridge of high pressure will tend to build in behind it, or a spell of more settled weather, I should say, for Friday. But this area of low pressure will bring some pretty wintry conditions, getting much colder for a while across the eastern side of the states, but it's warm and sunny across the southwest into California and pretty mild up into towards the Pacific Northwest as well. Much of Mexico largely dry on Friday. The weak weather front spreading its way southeastwards across parts of Central America and into the Caribbean will tend to fizzle out. So by the weekend, we should. Its active weather front bringing more thundery downpours parts of Paraguay and Uruguay. Now, this troublesome dust. This area of low pressure will slowly ebb away during the weekend, so conditions will improve across Iberia. Elsewhere across Europe, it's mainly dry and settled thanks to high pressure. Across Africa, well, it's the northwest corner which will be affected by that area of low pressure, but even here, northern Morocco, Algeria, will start to see conditions improving with more dry and brighter weather into the weekend. Much of the Middle East is fine and settled this weekend. Fairly gusty winds around the Gulf, so here we could see some lifted dust and a much better prospect across the Levant this weekend with more sunshine around. Plenty of dry and sunny weather across South Asia. There is still a threat of a few showers and thunderstorms breaking out, mainly Sri Lanka, perhaps down the western Ghats and into southern India and perhaps into the northeast. Otherwise, much of the north will be dry, sunny and hot. Japan. Behind it, cooler, fresher but brighter conditions move down from the northwest. We've got to the mid to high teens for Beijing and also for Seoul, so not as warm as it has been, but drier and brighter. Warm and sunny into Indochina, maybe an odd thunderstorm around across central and northern Thailand, and it's the usual mixture of sunshine and downpours across Malaysia and Indonesia. Some wet weather pushing into Western Australia thanks to this area of low pressure. Very unwelcome rain will be affecting parts of New South Wales and Queensland through this weekend. And this very deep area of low pressure, which has brought record-breaking rainfall across parts of the northeast of the North Island of New Zealand, will continue to bring some rain this weekend. Elsewhere, it should be largely dry.
What we hope and pray that finally after 40 years, the people of Afghanistan will have peace and stability.
My view of feminism is still really the same, which is that I think feminism is fundamentally a justice movement.
Africa will always remain important for me, and so I will continue doing what I do.
I could not have had a career as a gay man.
When big names talk, they talk to the BBC.
This is BBC News. Welcome if you're watching here in the UK or around the globe. I'm Mariam Mashiri. Our top stories. President Biden is now in Poland to see for himself the humanitarian crisis ignited by the war in Ukraine. The United States and European Union announced a major deal on liquefied natural gas in an attempt to reduce Europe's reliance on Russian energy supplies.
We're going to work to ensure an additional 15 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas, LNG, for Europe this year.
Ukrainian officials say they fear around 300 people may have died in a Russian bomb attack on a theatre in the besieged city of Mariupol. In a show of strength and unity between NATO members, President Biden has arrived for talks in Poland. The president landed in the town of Rzeszów in the southeast of the country, around an hour from the border with Ukraine. He was greeted by the Polish defence minister and the US ambassador to Poland. Well, Mr. Biden has also been meeting US troops stationed in the area. He's due to hold talks with the Polish President Duda later today. Well, let's go now to Rzeszów and speak to our correspondent Dan Johnson there. And Dan, a hugely symbolic visit by the President.
Yes, absolutely. This is an enormous show of support, not just for the 2.2 million Ukrainian refugees who have come to Poland, but for this country, for all the countries of Eastern Europe, where there's been growing nervousness about that Russian aggression just across the border in Ukraine. I've been here for more than 2 weeks now. I've spoken to Polish people in this part of the country who are concerned that that conflict could potentially spill over the border and affect them. And they are also on the front line of the humanitarian response, trying to help, trying to house, trying to clothe, trying to keep warm all those Ukrainians who have come across fleeing war. So the president is here talking to some of those people, talking to aid volunteers, talking to some of those refugees, and meeting US military personnel as well. There are around 10,000 US soldiers stationed in Poland. That's a presence to some degree that's been here for a long, long time. There's always been US military presence in Poland, but it has increased in recent months, and President Biden is at the moment meeting some of those troops from the 82nd Airborne Division. Things on this visit have had to be rejigged slightly because when Air Force One landed here at Rzeszów, the Polish President, Andrzej Duda, wasn't actually here on time to meet President Biden. His plane bringing him from Warsaw had to turn round and make an emergency landing because of a technical issue. Now, all was fine. The plane landed safely. President Duda was put on another plane, and he has landed here at Rzeszów. But President Biden had already changed the itinerary. He's gone to meet US service personnel, then he'll return here shortly to the airport to meet some of those humanitarian aid volunteers and to talk to the Polish president about the conflict next door and the pressure on Poland because it's on the front line of the refugee response.
Absolutely, and there's so much for the two men to talk about, given Poland's key role in what has been happening over the past month.
Absolutely, yes. Poland has taken by far more Ukrainian refugees than any other country. Not all of those 2.2 million have stayed in Poland, but estimates range from 1 million to 1.5 million people who are still being housed in Polish towns, cities, in Polish families' homes. The generosity has been enormous, but the warning had been consistent for weeks now that if the fighting continued and more people came, the pressure simply wasn't bearable. So there's been a call for more international support on that front, but there is growing concern in the Polish government and for the Polish people, for all people in Eastern Europe, about the level of aggression that is being displayed by the Russian military in Ukraine. The response to that, we've seen more people signing up to the Polish Defence Force. We've seen increased defence spending from the Polish government. So I think this visit from President Biden, the fact that Air Force One sits there on the tarmac so close to Ukraine, will be of reassurance to people and politicians here in Eastern Europe.
Dan, thank you very much indeed. Dan Johnson there. Well, I'm joined now by Michał Baranowski, Director of the Warsaw Office of the German Marshall Fund in Warsaw. And it's very good to talk to you. Let me ask you, first of all, what do you think about what has happened so far between Russia and Ukraine, and more importantly, Poland's key role in what has been happening?
Well, what is happening is, of course, a bloody war that Russia has started and has moved to a stalemate in military terms, but of course, a war of attrition, very brutal towards civilians. So, we are seeing really, no question about it, the biggest conflict since World War II, the biggest migration crisis since World War II. And we are at the moment, at this sort of a moment that the war has to go one way or another. And the West, with the meetings yesterday, with the NATO summit, G7, is pushing clearly on Russia to step back and sit down eventually to the negotiation table to finish this bloody war.
What do you think about Poland's role? I mean, do you think the way that Poland is viewed within Europe has changed over the last 30 days? What's the difference that this has all made?
I do think that Poland's reputation, the picture of Poland has changed. On one hand, Poland's role is key as a bridge to Ukraine, both for the refugees coming out to Poland and to the rest of the EU, but also for the humanitarian aid as well as military aid going into Ukraine. I think clearly Polish society is now perceived as it should be, as a very open and kind to our brothers and sisters from Ukraine, from the East. And this is to quite a big contrast to how Poland was viewed during 2015 migration crisis, where the reaction of the government and to some extent also of the voters was quite different. So there is a big shift, and of course Poland is a key military player when it comes to the security of the eastern flank and when it comes to providing the aid to Ukrainians fighting this bloody war.
Do you think that the Polish government is worried about what could potentially happen next, particularly if, as what you described, this war of attrition continues and President Putin feels perhaps potentially backed into some sort of corner?
Unfortunately, yes, we are very worried, because even though President Putin is certainly not winning the war the way he wanted to be winning the war, he's losing the war, if anything. He's backed into a corner, but the conversation, chatter, intelligence about the use of chemical weapons has been very, very worrying, and that's unfortunately not something that can be excluded.
Michał, let me keep you there for a second. Don't go anywhere. I want to take us to Rzeszów in Poland. Well, let's listen to what President Biden is saying to troops right now.
You know, we're a unique country in many ways, and we're the only country in the world not organized based on geography or ethnicity or religion or race or anything else. We're based on an idea. Literally the only country in the world based on an idea. That we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all women and men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Sounds corny, but it's the truth of who we are. We've never lived up to it, but we've never walked away from it. And the rest of the world looks to us. Because, you know, we not only lead by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. And your generation combines both. The rest of the world looks at you and sees who you are. They see you are a multi-ethnic group of Americans that are, in fact, together and united in one resolve to defend your country and to help those who need help. That's why you're here. I spent a lot of time in Ukraine when I was a senator and vice president. I've spoken to the Rada in the days when they, in fact, didn't have what you'd call democracy, and was there in the Maidan when the former leader had to take off and head into Russia. And so yes, we've been trained since back when Russia moved into in the southeast Ukraine. But also the average citizen. Look at how they're stepping up. Look at how they're stepping up. And you're going to see when you're there, and some of you have been there, you're going to see women, young people standing in the middle in front of a damn tank, just saying, I'm not leaving. I'm holding my ground. They're incredible. But they take a lot of inspiration from us. And you know, woman who just died, the Secretary of State, used to have an expression. She said, "We are the essential nation." It sounds like a bit of hyperbole, but the truth of the matter is, you are the organizing principle around which the rest of the world is, the free world is moving. And we're in the midst of, and I don't want to sound too philosophic here, but you're in the midst of a fight between democracies and oligarchs. Xi Jinping, who I've spent more time with, they tell me, than any other world leader, points out to me he believes in China that democracies can't succeed in the 21st century. The reason is things are moving so fast, change is happening so quickly, that democracies require consensus. And we can't put together consensus as quickly as autocrats can. So what's at stake, not just in what we're doing here in Ukraine to try to help the Ukrainian people and keep the massacre from continuing, but beyond that, what's at stake is what are your kids and grandkids going to look like in terms of their freedom? What's happening? The last 10 years have been fewer democracies that have been formed than we've lost in the world. So this is what you're engaged in is much more than just whether or not you can alleviate the pain and suffering of the people of Ukraine. We're in a new phase. Your generation, we're at an inflection point. About every 4 or 5 generations that comes along and changes, fundamental change takes place. The world ain't going to be the same, not because of Ukraine, but I'm not going to be the same 10, 15 years from now in terms of our organizational structures. And the question is, who's going to prevail? Are democracies going to prevail and the values we share, or autocracy is going to prevail? And that's really what's at stake. So what you're doing is consequential, really consequential. And as I said to a group in the dining room, you all in the chow plant, mess hall, the fact of the matter is that you are the finest, this is not hyperbole, you are the finest fighting force in the history of the world. Let me say it again. The finest fighting force in the history of the world. Part of the reason is you've had to fight so much for the last 20 years. It's for real. There are not many generations. You know, the greatest generation was my father's generation, your grandparents' generation, World War II generation. But nobody, no other generation has had to be in a battle, have your buddy blown up, wipe the blood off the Humvee and get back in and saddle up and go for another 6 months. Second time I flew in, I've been in and out of Iraq and Afghanistan about 40 times, 30-some times, 38 times. And every time I'd go in, I'd see, like the last time I flew in, and I flew in I'm up in the cockpit when I was landing in Bagram. And there were 6 people came up with the cargo, basically.
Well, that's President Biden talking to troops stationed in Rzeszów in Poland. He talked about the fight between democracy and autocracy and which one would prevail. He also called the US troops the finest fighting force in the history of the world. Let's bring our guest back, Michał Baranowski. Michał, thank you for staying with us. I wanted to ask you, President Biden's trip to Poland is significant, isn't it, in terms of bringing the two countries closer together? What has their relationship been up until now, and how important is this visit, do you think?
It is a crucial visit. This is President Biden's 3rd trip to Europe, but also only 1st trip to Poland. At the same time, Poland is the only country that I can think of that was visited by all the key US national officials. Now, the president, earlier vice president, secretary of defense, and secretary of state. The visit is so important precisely because of what President Biden is talking about right now. The war in Ukraine is not a regional war. It's not a proxy war. It's a fight between democracies on one hand and autocracies on the other hand. Just this time we have a real front line. And for Poland, this is a war next door, but it's also existential for us. Ukrainians are our dear friends, but we also know that if Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, he will go further. Therefore, we all absolutely have this, it's the highest stakes to make sure that he fails in Ukraine and does not pose a threat neither to Ukraine nor to Article 5 territory within NATO.
Do you think, Michal, there is enough support there for countries like Poland who are bearing the brunt very much of what is happening?
Well, we are still in the beginning of the process. So my answer to you right now is not yet. The US and the alliance is moving very fast. I'm sure that you talk about it on the program, that there is 10,000 US troops already in Poland. But we are facing a totalitarian, semi-fascist Russia. I'm not even sure about the semi anymore. And what we need to see is really a change in the force structure of the alliance. NATO needs to bring much heavier forces to the border, as well as air and missile defense, because for the moment, right now, Russia, unfortunately, with the war in Ukraine, with taking over Belarus, is a very powerful and a dangerous actor in our region.
OK, well, Michal Baranowski, Director of the Warsaw Office of the German Marshall Fund. It's been really interesting to get your point of view and your insights, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
And of course, we'll bring you more on that visit to Poland by President Biden here on BBC News. But for now, we'll talk about Ukrainian forces, because they are indeed continuing to counterattack and seize back lost territory around the capital, Kyiv. The latest British military analysis says Ukrainian troops are reoccupying towns and defensive positions up to 35 kilometres east of the city. In other words, as we've known for a while now, the war is not going to plan as far as President Putin is concerned. But the humanitarian situation in some cities under Russian attack is dire, in Mariupol especially, where Ukrainian officials now say some 300 people may have died in the bombing of a theatre last week where civilians were taking shelter. That number, though, cannot be independently verified. Well, the Russians have even more devastating weapons in their arsenal, which is why President Biden has warned the Kremlin not to use chemical weapons in this conflict. If it does, he says, NATO will respond in kind. From Ukraine, here's Jonah Fisher.
More than a week after it happened, footage has emerged from inside Mariupol's theatre of the terrifying moments just after it was destroyed. A missile hit the theatre right in the centre, the voice says, as people try to escape a building they'd come to for shelter. Fighting has made it hard to verify exactly how many died under the rubble. Local officials today said it could be several hundred. What is clear is that the theatre was marked with the Russian word deti, or children, and was targeted all the same. Kiev, the Ukrainian army is forcing the Russians back. The now ruined town of Makariv, 40 miles to the west of Kiev, was recaptured this week. And yesterday, a large Russian warship in the captured Ukrainian port of Berdyansk was sunk and several other ships damaged. To the south, Mykolaiv is another city that has defied the Russian ground advance and is now being targeted by artillery. On Tuesday night, a Russian shell hit Tatiana's apartment building, killing 2 of her neighbours and badly damaging her home. A quarter of all Ukrainians have been forced out of where they live. But Tatiana says she won't be going. We will fight till the end, as best we can, she says. Some with weapons, and some will help with moral support and by giving money to the army. A month into this war, Ukraine's president is still looking for a way out.
The country must move towards peace, move forward. With each day of our defence, we are bringing the peace we need so much closer. We're bringing victory closer. Because in this war, it is simply impossible for us not to win.
Ukraine, BBC News, Lviv.
Well, for children in Ukraine with serious health problems, the impact of war on their lives is especially agonising. As part of a major international push to offer life-saving treatment, Ukrainian children with cancer are being transported to 6 countries. Sophie Hutchinson reports now from Poland.
They have cancer, they are catastrophically ill. Unless treated, cancer is fatal, so they could all die with the interruption of treatment.
Lviv, is where their journey begins.
All these families are used to the stress, but now they have like two wars, one against cancer and the other against Russia.
This doctor has spearheaded the mission, gathering together young cancer patients from hospitals all over Ukraine and organising their onward journey to safety.
Hundreds of patients with cancer, children, being evacuated in convoys from one country.
Their families. 10 hours later, they arrived in the middle of Poland and into the arms of the emergency services, doctors and volunteers. Then onto a modest roadside hotel, transformed into an international medical triage centre, a ray of hope for these children.
It feels very tough. My husband is fighting.
We met Lesia and her 18-month-old son Pavlo after their first good night's sleep. He has a very rare bone cancer, but treatment in Ukraine was hard after they had to move to an air raid shelter.
Because of the air raids, we were running down to the shelter night and day. The chemo, the drips, there was no rest. It was a great stress for my boy. At night he was scared. I would take him asleep in my arms and run down the stairs.
Care, there's an 80% chance of being cured. Medicines and treatments being cut off. It's hard to overstate the importance to them of this rescue mission. For surgery as the bombing started.
We had an operation scheduled for that day. We were already at the hospital with my boy, and my husband called me in the morning and said the war has started, that our Dnipro, in the city where we live, and the airport was being bombed.
Kirill's older brother has travelled with him, but the rest of their family is back in Ukraine. Natalia says she can't believe what has happened to them.
It simply doesn't stack up, doesn't sit right in my head. It's like some nightmare.
In the weeks since the war started, around 600 young patients have been assessed here, and within just a couple of days, matched with hospitals in Europe and North America. The UK has taken in 21.
I can understand their pain.
Ina, who is herself a Ukrainian refugee, has been working to support the children and is in touch with some in the UK.
They sent me different short movies, how they live, where they stay. I can't imagine that in this dark, terrifying war, there is a light that our Ukrainian kids have chance to have treatment in such nice place.
This extraordinary rescue mission will continue. There are several thousand children with cancer in Ukraine, and of course countless others in need of hospital care in a place of safety. Sophie Hutchinson, BBC News, Poland.
Before we go, let's show you pictures that we took earlier into our newsroom of President Biden, the US President, arriving in Poland for the first day of his two-day trip to the country. This is the end of his European tour. He's in the country to talk to President Duda, of course, of Poland, about various issues pertaining to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its impact on, as you can see here, has been meeting the soldiers and democracy prevailing in that fight. I'm back in just a few minutes' time with more news. You can also reach me on Twitter. I'm at BBC Marianne, but do stay with us on BBC News.
How about a spark of inspiration? Ta-da! Try that on for size. Yeah! Level up in Forge of Empires. Play now for free at FOE.tv or download the app.
We empower those who act. Those who see the correlation between upswings and downswings. Those who manage risk by meeting each obstacle with a perfectly executed strategy, a measured approach, the right tools, driving accuracy. CME Group, where risk meets opportunity.
Hello there. Much of Europe is under the influence of a very big area of high pressure. So a lot of dry and sunny weather, as you can see here on the satellite picture. But this area of low pressure is continuing to bring a lot of very harsh conditions to Spain and Portugal. Now, we've continued with this very thick Sahara dust. So red skies, red atmosphere. This area of low pressure will be slowly easing through the weekend. A lot of dry and sunny weather across the southeast of Europe, much warmer across Greece and the Balkans than of late. We'll have this wet weather continuing to affect southern and eastern portions of Spain and the Balearics. Some sunshine starting to push into Portugal and northern Spain, but much of Central and Northern Europe will be fine and dry, plenty of sunshine. But we are looking at a change taking place across Scandinavia, in particular Finland, and across into the Baltic states. A deep low will be moving in here, and that'll bring some very cold conditions, very windy, with some heavy snowfall as we move through the weekend into next week. For London and for Paris, the milder conditions continue through the weekend, but into next week we see something a bit chillier move down from the north. Madrid starts to see increasing amounts of sunshine as that low pressure clears away, and Athens will stay largely fine and settled with around average temperatures.
Fire away, please, your question.
Still bringing people together.
Our audience members join us from Cambodia, France, Indonesia, Liberia.
Still asking questions.
Will bigger government intervention in the economy be the norm?
Still getting answers.
We never had such an experience in our lives.
I actually disagree.
I'm quite worried.
Your voice?
This is going to be a collective idea.
Still heard. Global Questions, this weekend on BBC World News.
This is the Russian attack playbook, perfected in over 10 years of war in Syria.
Tonight, it was far noisier, much louder, more constant, like rolling thunder for a very long time.
Remember, it was Russia that launched this offensive, sending its troops across the border into a sovereign nation.
If Vladimir Putin expected his troops...
The international news broadcaster. We are the leaders in global breaking news.
Lively debate from Delhi on business, money and life. Now on BBC World News, Work Life India.
Namaste, I'm Devina Gupta and this is Work Life India on the BBC from India. We are at one of the largest electronics market in Delhi. You can find spare parts for your computer, a variety of smartphones, wireless sets and much more over here. But these days it's not that easy. First, there was COVID restriction and the lockdown because of that. And now because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the supply of semiconductor chips to India has been impacted. And that's where markets like this one have been hit hard. Let's find out how.
All the pen drives that you see here have semiconductor chips in them.
Actually, मैं market में graphic card लेने आया हूँ.
I'm here to buy a graphic card because the one I have is damaged.
करना था इसलिए मैं market आया हूँ.
So what is a graphic card exactly? I can see this is a computer unit, it's a CPU that is put on a computer, on a desktop. And this is the portion. This is the graphic card that you're searching for?
ये graphic card
yes, this is the graphic card that I want.
इसको graphic card बोलते हैं.
And what is the price difference that you're noticing right now, compared to say 6 months or a year?
Yeah, जब मैंने ये graphic card लगवाया था.
When I bought this graphic card last year, I paid roughly $158, but now it's for $368. The price has more than doubled.
Meanwhile, the Indian government has announced a $10 billion investment plan to boost the production of semiconductor chips in India. But that will take time to bear fruit. So we're asking, how can India deal with the global chip crisis? Now we're back in the studio and let's take this conversation forward with our guest. Please welcome Parag Naik, who's CEO and co-founder of Sankhya Labs. He designs semiconductor chips. Hi Parag, are you spotting an opportunity in this crisis then?
That's true. In fact, you have to look like a madman in the short term for a long-term goal. Right now, we've turned from being heretics to thought leaders. And it's an exciting time to be in the semiconductor industry.
Well, we talk more about how your company is among the many which have been spotlighted because of the semiconductor chip shortage. But let's get our second guest in, Shruti Sabu, who's Associate Director of India Ratings and Research. And Shruti, welcome to the show. Your expertise is also in the auto industry. We spoke about and we met people in the electronics market to talk about the gadgets and the impact of semiconductor chips there. What's the immediate impact that you see right now on the auto industry?
Hi Devina. So yes, the immediate impact on the auto industry, it's like auto industry starts to recover and then there is a setback, and then it starts to recover and then there is a setback. So if we talk about auto industry today, it is the supply chain issues had just started to normalize, not really normalize, but they had started to ease in. The semiconductor chip shortages had improved slightly. But again, with this, Ukraine-Russia crisis, we are more, towards a uncertain environment as to what could happen maybe in the next couple of months.
So a double whammy sort of for the Indian auto industry. And we have the global companies, Ford, you have Toyota, all of them cutting production because of semiconductor chip shortage. So it is a serious problem. Ganesh Ramamurthy is Managing VP of Emerging Technology and Trends in Gartner is with us. And Ganesh has been studying very closely this market trend. Ganesh, has it happened before?
Yeah, first of all, thanks very much, Davina, for having me on your show. It's a pleasure being here. So, semiconductor shortage, yes, it's been going on for about 1.5 to 2 years. It has definitely impacted the automotive industry. And as you said, probably it is a kind of a double whammy with the Russia-Ukraine crisis that's going on now. But it really remains to be seen. I think one of the crucial raw materials there, palladium, which goes into the catalytic converters in the automobiles, that's creating a lot of impact for a lot of Western Europe automobile manufacturers. How does that kind of trickle down into Indian automobile manufacturers is something that we have to wait and see. But yes, I definitely see it's uncertain times for the industry in the next 3 to 4 months time period for sure. That's for sure, yes.
3 to 4 months is where the pain is going to be felt in your estimate. But Ganesh, how has it impacted you personally? Because I do know there is a laptop that you're working on and it's been quite difficult to get a replacement part for it.
Yeah, it's really a funny episode, right? I mean, around about the first week of March, one fine morning, I open up my laptop and suddenly the display is gone. So I kind of called up the support service guys and told them that this is the problem. What can you folks do? And they promptly returned my call the very next day, probably even the evening, I guess, and did a kind of a remote diagnostics. They did some kind of online video call stuff and tried to figure out what the problem was. And they said, okay, there seems to be some problem with the motherboard and this needs to be replaced. And I asked them, how long is this going to take? They said, probably 2 days, sir, is what they said. And now it's 3 weeks and still waiting for that motherboard to come to me. They haven't gotten a hold of the parts or the component that they really need to kind of fix this problem. But I think the lesson that I've learned is that if you got an electronic equipment, everybody's got one, of course.
Yeah.
Please handle them really, really very carefully in the next few months time period at least, because if you mess with them, if something goes wrong with them, you are not going to be able to find the parts for it so very easily. There is an absolute shortage for these kind of parts at this point in time. So either you kind of take care of it or just probably kind of prepare to live without those electronic gadgets for the next 2-3 months time.
I can see how you've covered your printer behind you, carefully preserved with a yellow cloth.
Absolutely.
So that there is no harm coming to that printer. But a lot of us are going through that phase, because the person I met in the Nehru Place market also said the same thing. His graphic card wasn't working and he's been trying to get a graphic card, and which was costing almost more than double the price because of a shortage of components. And coming to you, Shruti, then tell us about this. Right time to book a car, or should you wait?
See, already the waiting period for a car, in certain cases is as high as 10 to 11 months.
Wow.
And given the uncertainty, that could, kind of go up. So I think it's a good time to buy a car. You should buy a car before prices go up even further or the waiting period, increases further.
So, but there would be a waiting period significantly right now because there are about 1,500 to 3,000 semiconductor components that are used in a modern car. So if you are to book a car today, even after that waiting period, what kind of customer experience are you seeing being impacted because of the shortage right now?
There are certain negatives. For example, the OEMs are now delivering cars with relatively lesser features, or they are eliminating certain features, which could be even probably retrofitted later on. So for example, some of the OEMs in India today are selling cars, for example, without an additional remote for the keyless entry, or there could be something like let's say these what you call it, sequential indicators, sequential turn-on indicators, those are not there in the cars. So those features, have reduced to a certain extent. This is something which we were seeing also in the global markets last year, where some of the major OEMs were selling without infotainment systems, which could be, retrofitted later on, or satellite navigations were missing. But now what we are seeing, even Indian OEMs are also, kind of, following the path and trying to deliver without some of these features.
All right. So OEMs again are original equipment manufacturers. So you can book a car. You could wait also for that car, but with the feature, there could be a compromise as far as semiconductor chip shortage is concerned for now. And Parag, that's where the question is, where do companies that are designing semiconductor chips like yours stand? Because you manufacture it at in some other country, you get raw materials from some other country, so it's sort of a global supply chain. How has this shortage impacted you and your business?
It has, like I said, it's positively impacted us to an extent, because people now understand what semiconductors are, and they know that they're really important. It's not all about building mobile apps. There is something that behind the mobile apps that fuels the apps and all the stuff. That's the positive part. The negative part is basically we are not able to service our customers, and the costs also have gone up for us as. Our vendors have hiked their prices. They've also the fabs, that is, and they've also have increased the delivery schedule. So sometimes the delivery schedules have sometimes even doubled. So therefore, servicing orders are becoming a challenge.
But when the orders are delayed with your vendors, are you able to explain it to them, and they're willing to also sort of understand that this is a global crisis? This is not just India crisis?
They do understand it, but there are these usual negotiations that go on with our vendors and with our customers. Though everybody knows to do it, knows the issues around there, and everybody has to live with it. There are always these negotiations that go on, to see how we can handle this immediate crisis.
Well, what's the advantage of operating such a business from India?
Well, actually none. So it's only, it's practically, in a country where, sorry, but selling lingerie on the internet is considered tech. So we have to differentiate ourselves as deep tech, right? So we are a deep tech company in that sense. That's a new phraseology that's come up in the recent times. There is practically no ecosystem in India for building hardware solutions. In the entire semiconductor ecosystem or the supply chain, the only part where India has played a role so far has been supplying raw material, that is people. Beyond people, we have not done much in the semiconductor supply chain, or being a net consumer, be it the auto industry or be it the smartphone industry or other forms of electronics that we consume. It's only now that in the last couple of years, it has dawned to people in the government and the rest of the industry that this is a strategic sector. It's very important for us to play in the global supply chain. Though we might not dominate it, we might not have all of it here. We have to be at least part of it. Right?
So basically, obviously, awareness has been an issue. When somebody like you got into the industry about what this industry is about in India. But Ganesh, now even the Indian government has outlined some $10 billion worth of investment to encourage more startups in this space, to encourage more manufacturing of semiconductor chips in this space by big companies also. Do you see this plugging the gap where India could be a chip manufacturer as well, not only a designer and a consumer?
I do want to say that it is going to help. But if you look at the history of how semiconductor industry has kind of started, it basically started off with a whole lot of, as Parag mentioned, people power. You had TI setting up its shop with Wipro. That's how the design houses came into being in India. And I'm remembering 2007 when the first semiconductor policy came out, which talked about setting up semiconductor fabs in India. That's 2007. We are in 2022. And we've probably kind of pretty much refurbished those policies back in again, and we've got them to wherever it is right now. We are seeing definitely a lot more interest from non-technology companies wanting to kind of do this manufacturing. And that's why you see companies like Vedanta and Foxconn wanting to do some business in the semiconductor manufacturing space based on all of those new announcements that's come up there. Is that enough for us to kind of propel India into a semiconductor manufacturing hub? I doubt that. And the reason for that essentially is because we don't have the raw materials that are required for semiconductor manufacturing. The wafers are going to be coming in from countries like Japan, right? And a whole bunch of other chemicals and gases that are going to be needed to produce all of these semiconductors is all going to be coming from outside. The equipments are going to be coming from Western Europe. So the whole bunch of this ecosystem is currently really very absent at this point in time.
Okay, Parag wants to come in, and I want to also ask you, Parag, what can be done then? What is the solution? Go ahead, Parag.
Yeah, so just to carry on from where Ganesh left off, Samsung, the foundry, has invested about $100 billion into the semiconductor ecosystem for themselves. So look at it, the government is doing 10 billion. I would still say it's a good start. It's better than nothing. And I would also like to give your viewers analogy in terms of sports, right? If you look at China in the 80s, the number of the Olympic tally that they had and that Olympic tally that India had was more or less the same. They put out a 10 or 20-year roadmap and then see today where China is and where we are, right? So semiconductors is also the same. You need about 10, 15 years of strategic thinking, consistent investment, no change in policy, bipartisan support across the entire spectrum to make it a success. After that, you would still not be 100% localized, but at least you would play maybe 10, 20% of the supply chain, which is good enough. And then the other part is to focus not so much on the manufacturing part, but on the design part, where we have got a lot of talent. Practically every chip that's designed in the world has a Bangalore hand to it.
Yes, the Silicon Valley of India. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, of India, right? So we have Bangalore hand to it. So the talent is there. What is missing is the finance ecosystem, and and also the buyer ecosystem. So you don't even have a buyer ecosystem in India, which is now changing slowly.
But looking at the history, as you talked about, Parag, the US accounted for nearly 40% of the world's silicon wafer production in the 90s, and the EU was accounting for more than, let's say, about 20%, according to the figures cited by Washington and Brussels. But the US is now below 15%, and the EU has about 10%, while the Taiwanese company TSMC holds 50% of the market. Now, Shruti, even as India is investing more, how difficult will it be to find a foothold in this market? Can India even catch up? Or is this just like a drop in the ocean?
So it would not be an easy walk for India. Now, having said that, there could be certain, sub-assembly components or the not so complex chips, for example, not going to 3 or 5 nanometer chips, but those ones which are more so used in auto sector, for example 2 nanometer chips. India could start with that, and it could gradually find a footprint for itself in the global markets.
Okay, blue ocean strategy. Go where your competency is and not where the competition is, where already there is sort of a bloodbath situation, but go to the place where you can harness the skills and think ahead. But Shruti, for now, as we look at this global chip crisis, what's been your advice, especially to those in the auto industry, operating in India, seeing this jump in demand, especially in passenger vehicles after the pandemic? What's your advice to them? How should they move forward in this scenario?
So I think, if you look at last 1.5 year, while initially, we saw a lot of production cuts and plant shutdowns, but gradually most of the OEMs found out ways to manage this crisis, and they were operating more efficiently. They prioritized models which were, more profit making for them. So going forward, I think to manage this crisis, this would be a solution, coupled with the fact that OEMs and auto components both are entering into long-term contracts with these suppliers, because it's not just in time, it's more a more planned and more mature model that they are following as far as the sourcing of these chips is concerned. So that is, I think, one of the ways that OEMs would continue to deal with this crisis.
OEMs again are original equipment manufacturers. Yes, Ganesh, you want to come in?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point that Shruti just mentioned. We are actually hearing a lot of the automobile manufacturers. Of course, these are Western Europe, American automobile manufacturers, kind of slightly going the vertical integration path, which basically means that in the past, they were relying on the semiconductor companies to supply them the critical chips, the semiconductors that would go into their vehicle. Now that they burnt their fingers, they are saying, okay, let me start designing and manufacturing my own semiconductors as well there, right? So that vertical integration is probably a kind of a big deviation from the just-in-time, kind of strategy that they used to have in the past. And we are probably going to see this kind of a move in a couple of other related industries as well, which have had a significant disruption because of this semiconductor shortage. And we'll see this in the next 2 to 3 years, definitely, in my opinion.
Okay, but Parag, is there also a difference in the way you're designing semiconductor chips? Because there's a raw material shortage and there's a global supply chain disruption. Has there been a significant difference there?
No, we designed what's called CMOS chipsets. So that has not changed. The design process hasn't changed. What Ganesh was alluding to was what passes off as compound semiconductors, gallium arsenide and silicon carbide kind of stuff. That's something that we can look for from a manufacturing perspective. It's still a open area, and then we can do it. Maybe going forward in next couple of years or 5 years, there might be other models. One advantage that Taiwan doesn't have that we have right now, for the next few years at least, is geopolitical stability, right? So everybody is starting to look at second sourcing stuff, and therefore the TSMC itself is building fabs now in the US, just to ensure that there's no disruption because of any adverse geopolitical events.
Has proposed right now. It's still in the planning stage, though, and there are critics who are skeptical about that plan. But you do have, of course, say the US chipmaker Intel Corp, which is now going for investment in cutting-edge semiconductors in Germany, for example, in addition to adding new plants in Arizona and Ohio. So, of course, we've seen that there are global players who are also coming out. But again, Ganesh, there is also a sense of protectionism when you see the other countries. For example, you had the US and the EU recently promising additional packages to chip makers. You've had China jumping in, you've had Japan jumping in. So this seems to be what many are calling the subsidy war for chip making. And there is a threat of localization that can diminish global cooperation, which is needed for this industry.
No, I like to actually call this as techno-nationalism, because every country wants a little bit of supremacy in the technology. They like to have the control on the technologies that is driving their economy. I think this really got kind of triggered with the US-China trade war thing, and suddenly everybody realized that their entire economy, which is being driven by technology, is actually kind of held in control by few select countries. And because they have this controlling power in terms of the supply chain at this point in time, this is going to aggravate the risk across the supply chain, down the supply chain for all other countries. I think that is one of the primary motivations probably, in many of these initiatives that you see from different governments there. US wants to control its technology. The Western European countries wants to hold a control on its technology. And on the similar lines, I would also expect Indian government to also kind of start thinking in those directions as well there. I think it's quite natural. We will definitely see more kind of governments talking about these. How many of them are really successful? How many of them are really able to execute on that plan? is again something that we'll have to wait and watch. Yeah.
Okay, so Ganesh, as we wrap up this conversation, what's your projection about the chip crisis shortage? How long will it last, given that, of course, there are external factors which are beyond anyone's control, including the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Our projection is that it will go into the first quarter 2023. Things will start kind of beginning to normalize in the second quarter of 2023. That's where our projection is.
What about you, Shruti? Till when do you see this crisis unfolding?
So, as I said, it could take another, 2 to 3 quarters. And if I talk about auto industry, the auto industry has already registered a loss of somewhere around 3 lakh, units in this fiscal. And there could be definitely not as significant as FY22, but we could still see some production loss happening in FY23 as well, and there could be a revenue loss in FY23.
So 300,000 units already on hold, and you're saying that not only in this fiscal year but next fiscal year as well. So pretty much on the lines to what Ganesh has said. But Parag, for a company which is operating in this difficult environment and which is also looking at hopefully easing of supply chains, is this also a time where you're looking at double booking or a panic buying?
Part of the crisis is because of panic buying, and some creative finance guys think of just in time, right? So like Ganesh said, the supply chains are not resilient. So it's a combination of that, a lot of speculative buying also.
For how long now?
Next 2-3 quarters, I think they are better suited for the research than I am. But I think I tend to agree with them. It's going to take about at least 3 quarters before things ease out.
All right, so Parag, your timeline is again working on Shruti and Ganesh's timeline. Hopefully, we will see resolution to the global supply chain and the shortage of chip crisis soon. And India will be at a better position to be in this market. Baby steps is what I'm getting from this conversation. It'll take baby steps to at least be in this market for Indian companies. But thank you so much, Parag, Shruti and Ganesh, for joining us.
Thank you very much. Pleasure being here.
Thank you, Devina. It was nice talking to you as well.
Thank you, guys. Well, with that, it's a wrap. Do tell us your views on the show. You can tweet using the hashtag WorkLifeIndia or write to us on Delhi_WorkLifeIndia at bbc.co.uk. And till we meet next time, it's Namaste from Devina.
On the Belarusian side, migrants started throwing rocks and bricks and branches towards the Polish forces.
A week of commemorative events in honor of Archbishop Tutu is well underway all over South Africa.
The clashes are taking place just a few hundred meters away from where I'm standing now. You can hear the sound of shooting and explosions.
This is a storm that has now claimed at least 14 lives overnight. You had people rushing to their basements.
We break stories from more places than any other international news broadcaster. We are the leaders in global breaking news.
As the sun rises over the Caspian, get ready to embrace the day. Come and listen to the whispering sea. Make the most of Azerbaijan with its mountainous beauty. Just stop for a second. Take in the incredible landscapes. Experience them every way you can. Reconnect with nature. Set your spirit free. Azerbaijan. Take another look.
Oh, how about a spark of inspiration? Oops! Let's get this thing rolling. Ta-da! Try that on for size. Yeah! Level up in Forge of Empires. Play now for free at FOE.tv or download the app.
Since the beginning of the human story, the stars, planets and the dazzling Milky Way have been a constant presence in the night sky.
They have helped us navigate the oceans and chart time, and they have inspired great works of art.
But worsening light pollution means the glories of the night sky are now hidden from many of us.
In this programme, we'll be looking at the impact of light pollution, not just on astronomy, but on life itself.
And we'll also be discovering how to work around light pollution, lessen its impact, and looking at ways to provide beautiful dark skies for future generations to enjoy.
It's an incredibly alluring and attractive place to go. I was really excited to visit somewhere that's so hard to get to, somewhere that so little is known about. It's absolutely crucial that we understand what is happening at Thwaites Glacier, because what happens in Antarctica is all our futures. Only 4 people had ever been there before, so it's all the more important that we get there with our cameras and show people the changes that are taking place.
So we've been filming out here for an hour and a half, and this is the result. And it gives you an idea of why it's so hard to operate here.
But there's also a story about getting to where we're going, about telling the story of what it's like to be there. It took us 5 weeks to get to the front of the glacier, and because of all the delays, what I didn't expect was to be camping on ice for 5 weeks.
It has taken years of preparation to get the scientists out here. Only by taking measurements here can we hope to get accurate predictions of how sea level is going to rise in the future.
This is a really important story. This is something people need to know. Every coastline in the world will be changed by what happens in that part of Antarctica.
It's shocking, and you know, we should all be upset by what's happening here.
So I found it incredibly emotional to see the changes that were happening, but at the same time really reassuring to see this collective scientific effort to understand what's happening. And if we can understand it, we can do something about it.
This is BBC News. Welcome if you're watching here in the UK or around the globe. I'm Geeta Gurumurthy. Our top stories. President Biden touches down in Poland. He's been telling US troops that they're fighting for the freedom of generations still to come.
What's at stake is what are your kids and grandkids going to look like in terms of their freedom.
His visit comes as new military analysis suggests Ukraine has retaken some areas from the Russian military. But in the besieged city of Mariupol, it's feared that around 300 people may have died in last week's Russian bomb attack on a theatre where civilians were sheltering. Also on the programme, could landmines and unexploded bombs leave Ukraine with a deadly legacy? I'll be talking to the head of a landmines charity. Hello, thanks for joining us. In a show of strength and unity between NATO members, President Biden has arrived for talks in Poland. The president landed in the town of Rzeszów in the southeast of the country around an hour from the border with Ukraine. He was greeted by the Polish defense minister and the US ambassador to Poland. He's also been holding talks with the Polish president, Andrzej Duda. Well, earlier, Mr. Biden met US troops stationed in the area, and addressing them in the last hour, he said the war in Ukraine was a battle between democracy and autocracy.
You're in the midst of a fight between democracies and oligarchs. Xi Jinping, who I've spent more time with, they tell me, than any other world leader, points out to me he believes in China that democracies can't succeed in the 21st century. The reason is things are moving so fast, change is happening so quickly, that democracies require consensus, and we can't put together consensus as quickly as autocrats can. So what's at stake, not just in what we're doing here in Ukraine to try to help the Ukrainian people and keep the massacre from continuing, but beyond that, what's at stake is what are your kids and grandkids going to look like in terms of their freedom.
President Biden speaking a little earlier. Well, that visit is continuing. Let me just show you the live pictures that we're getting in here. President Biden sitting there with the Polish President, Andrzej Duda. I think the Polish President speaking in Polish at the moment. But we have been trying to give you as much of a flavour of that very important visit by the US President, the closest he's come, of course, to Ukrainian territory itself, just near the border there on the Polish side, of course. Let's go to Rzeszów and speak to our correspondent, Dan Johnson, who's following events for us. Dan, in terms of the political significance of this visit, we know that President Biden is delivering key messages for a domestic audience and for an international audience, but it is very significant that he is in Poland today.
Absolutely, yes. The symbolism could hardly be more stark than Air Force One with the American flag there sitting on the ground so close to the Ukrainian border. A show of support from the US president for the Polish people, for its government, for all the countries of Eastern Europe that have been concerned about the Russian aggression in Ukraine and what it could potentially mean for them, not just in terms of the conflict potentially exacerbating, spilling over borders, but also in terms of the refugee humanitarian effort. Poland has taken more than 2.2 million people from Ukraine in the last month. That's more than any other country. It's been a very warm, generous, open-hearted welcome, but the warning has been that this country, the cities on the eastern edge of Poland, simply cannot continue absorbing those numbers of people. It's also a sign of reassurance, I think, from the US president that the United States and that NATO will stand firm with countries like Poland. We've seen the government here increasing defence spending from 2.2% to 3% of GDP. We've seen announcements that they may amend the constitution if they think they need to extend that spending even further and get the country into more debt. We've also seen announcements on reducing Russia's influence in the economy here, all things that have brought condemnation from the Russian former president, Dmitry Medvedev, who spoke this week, launched an attack on the government here. So the US president, he's met US service personnel who are in Poland as well, about 10,000 of them now serving here. So rallying support amongst his own troops, but showing support for the people of Poland and for Eastern Europe, who are not just on the front line of absorbing the refugee crisis that has resulted from this conflict, but also feeling increasingly concerned about their own safety too.
The question for many is how far the US will go depending on Russian actions. So we saw President Biden saying that NATO would respond in kind, was the phrase that he used, if chemical weapons were used. Obviously, chemical weapons are banned internationally. But Biden has not spelled out, I'm sure deliberately, exactly what response the Americans or NATO would give if things escalate.
Exactly, yeah. This is a really tricky issue. There's no way that any Western NATO country, the United States, is going to use chemical weapons, but they clearly are concerned about the potential for Vladimir Putin to do that sort of thing. It's something that he has talked about, that he has potentially threatened. We know that it's happened in Syria before. It's something they are seriously concerned about. And we know that although the US, the West, NATO would never go that far, they are definitely involved in supplying weapons, not just to countries like Poland. This airport has become a major logistics military supply base. We've seen more weapons being sent to the Ukrainian military. So the West and NATO is stepping up, is taking part in resupplying the Ukrainians and the countries of Eastern Europe to try to reassure them, to try to aid the Ukrainian resistance, and as well to try to deal with the numbers of people who are fleeing from the war in Ukraine. So I think the president's visit here today is a major symbolic moment. President Duda has been taking his own steps to try to reassure his people. He was actually late for the meeting here today with President Biden because of an issue with his own plane, but they've rejigged the itinerary to make sure that the two presidents can have face-to-face time together before President Biden flies on to Warsaw before going home. So really important, significant talks, and a really important moment that the US president is seen to be here so close to the Ukrainian border.
Dan Johnson, thank you very much indeed. Well, Ukrainian forces are continuing to counterattack and seize back lost territory around the capital, Kiev. The latest British military analysis says Ukrainian troops are reoccupying towns and defensive positions up to 35 kilometres east of the city. In other words, as we've known for a little while now, the war is not going to plan as far as President Putin is concerned. But the humanitarian situation in some cities under Russian attack is dire. In Mariupol especially, where Ukrainian officials now say some 300 people may have died in the bombing of a theatre last week where civilians were taking shelter. That number can't be independently verified, of course. Well, the Russians have even more devastating weapons in their arsenal, which is why President Biden has warned the Kremlin not to use those chemical weapons in this conflict. If it does, he says NATO will respond. From Ukraine, Jonah Fisher reports.
More than a week after it happened, footage has emerged from inside Mariupol's theatre of the terrifying moments just after it was destroyed. A missile hit the theatre right in the centre, the voice says, as people try to escape a building they'd come to for shelter. Fighting has made it hard to verify exactly how many died under the rubble. Local officials today said it could be several hundred. What is clear is that the theatre was marked with the Russian word deti, or children, and was targeted all the same. While in Mariupol the Russians are still making slow progress, elsewhere they've largely ground to a halt. Indeed, there have been some indications, particularly around Kiev, that the Ukrainian army is forcing the Russians back. The now ruined town of Makariv, 40 miles to the west of Kiev, was recaptured this week. And yesterday, a large Russian warship in the captured Ukrainian port of Berdyansk was sunk and several other ships damaged. To the south, Mykolaiv is another city that has defied the Russian ground advance and is now being targeted by artillery. On Tuesday night, a Russian shell hit Tatiana's apartment building, killing 2 of her neighbours and badly damaging her home. A quarter of all Ukrainians have been forced out of where they live, but Tatiana says she won't be going. We will fight till the end, as best we can, she says, some with weapons and some will help with moral support and by giving money to the army. A month into this war, Ukraine's president is still looking for a way out.
The country must move towards peace, move forward. With each day of our defence, we are bringing the peace we need so much closer. We're bringing victory closer. Because in this war, it is simply impossible for us not to win.
Ukraine is stopping Russia winning, but there's no sign yet that Moscow is ready for peace. Jonah Fisher, BBC News, Lviv.
Well, Ukraine could face decades of landmine tragedies as a result of unexploded munitions left behind by the Russian invasion. That's according to the landmine removal charity, the Halo Trust. I'm joined now by James Cowan, Chief Executive of the Halo Trust. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. How many landmines are being planted in Ukraine? Because both sides are involved in that, aren't they?
Well, we're there from the previous war in 2014. We've got 430 staff who were working in the east of the country clearing landmines from that period, and they were laid then in prolific numbers. We can't know how many landmines are being laid now, but actually our work is much broader than just landmines. We're clearing all the types of ordnance that are being used in this war, and this is a war that will be remembered principally for the very indiscriminate use of rockets, artillery and other forms of violence upon the cities of Ukraine. So the role of the Halo Trust after this conflict is going to be extremely important indeed.
So can you tell me a bit about how you're working at the moment, given all the dangers on the ground? Are you clearing away missiles and artillery shells that are being used in this current conflict?
So it's really difficult for us. Our programme is in the east of the country. 21 of my staff have been trapped in Mariupol. A few have got out. And you can imagine, really, it's really not possible to do anything of a humanitarian sense in that city. The rest are in Kramatorsk. And my plan is actually to move them from Kramatorsk westwards and to re-establish the programme there. We've had fantastic generosity from the British public and from donors. So we're beginning to raise the money to be able to build a much larger programme in the West. But we are getting on with stuff. We're reaching millions of Ukrainian children, giving them risk education. We can do survey for humanitarian corridors. We can prove routes. Most of my staff are paramedically trained, so we could administer first aid to the wounded. And ultimately, though, we want to get on with our primary role, which is explosive ordnance disposal. And it is a task of truly monumental scale. If you imagine that Ukraine is the 5th largest wheat producer in the world, you imagine if landmines are laid in the countryside and this year's crop is not planted, there will be no harvest. And all that wheat will not reach either Ukraine or the global market.
Yes, I mean, I read tragically that even the Ukrainians are planting wheat fields with landmines, and we know that that is going to have a global impact in parts of the world many, many miles away. Can you just explain that for us?
Yeah, I mean, we know from previous conflicts how persistent landmines are. You know, we're still working in Angola. Angola still has 1,200 minefields from its war, which are still not cleared 30 years after the war ended. And this in Ukraine is a much larger war. So I want to give a sense of scale here and the truly enormous effect that this explosive ordnance will have, not only on human beings, but on the global economy.
And when you say that you are trying to educate children about the risks and that obviously clearing away this sort of ordnance is extremely dangerous, can you just again explain for me what your people are doing on the ground, how they work?
Yeah, so a lot of this can be delivered online, but it also is delivered through getting into schools. We have many years of experience of doing this in countries like Afghanistan. But essentially, many of the munitions delivered from the air, scatterable munitions, come with a little red ribbon on. They're very shiny, quite attractive looking objects. And for a child, it looks like a toy. So many children are killed and maimed by simply the innocent business of trying to pick up what looks like something to play with. It's a really horrific thing.
I'm sure many people will want to support your work. James Cowan, Chief Executive of the Halo Trust. We will have to leave it there, but thank you very much for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
A month into the invasion, how much ground have the Russian troops actually now taken? Let's hear from our security correspondent, Frank Gardner.
Well, we're now into the second month of this Russian invasion of Ukraine, and much of the battle picture hasn't really changed that much. But the majority of the fighting is taking place in the east of the country, around here, Lugansk and Donetsk. And this is where Russian forces are making some progress. They're pushing back the regular Ukrainian army units. We don't hear very much about that part of the war. There isn't a lot of reporting coming from it. A lot of the destruction has been around the port of Mariupol here. Russian forces have now reached the center of that city, but there are around 100,000 plus civilians still trapped in it. And some of the defenders there are some of the most die-hard Ukrainian defenders. They're going to fight to the death. The reason why that's so important is for Russia to link up its forces from Crimea here all the way through to their pro-Kremlin separatist republic allies in the east, which would give them a land corridor. What they also want to do is to try to take the port of Odessa over there. And that's why they're moving westwards towards the port, towards the town of Mykolaiv. Now, Odessa is busy defending itself. It's tying down quite a large number of Ukrainian troops in preparation for any kind of Russian assault. Finally, in the north, up here, Kyiv, it's pretty much a stalemate. The Ukrainians have managed to retake some small areas, such as the town of Makariv, where the Ukrainian flag has been seen flying there, and they've been able to push back Russian artillery at least 15, 20, some even. So the big question is where does all this leave President Vladimir Putin? Because this is very much his war. He didn't even share the intimate plans of it with many of his associates. Those plans included capturing the capital, Kyiv, early on, forcing a resignation of the government and putting in place a new government that would be sympathetic to Moscow. Well, that clearly hasn't happened. Ukraine has defied the odds, it's held on. So now there is a fear in Western capitals that in order to break the stalemate that much of this invasion has ground down to, that Russia is going to try something really dramatic and escalatory, such as using chemical or biological weapons. There's no proof so far that Russia is planning to do it, but that's the fear in the West.
Frank Gardner, our security correspondent there. Well, as we've been reporting, the city of Mykolaiv in the south has seen intense clashes. The city is considered strategically significant because of its links to the major seaport of Odessa and the Black Sea. Well, to find out what life is like there now, I'm joined by local resident Taisia, an IT consultant living in Mykolaiv. Thank you very much for joining us. Just tell us, what has life been like there for you?
Yeah. So the life is bombing, is shelling most of the time, especially at night. So sleepless nights and broken lives, I would say.
And what is your job normally?
So normally I sit in front of my computer and work as support operator. So that's what I do.
And are you living with your family or with friends, or are you on your own?
I live with my grandma and my brother, and yeah, that's all.
And how difficult is it for everyone around you on a day-to-day basis?
So in a daily basis, it's not that difficult because when I remember about people in Mariupol and other cities, I cannot complain because it's a lot worse there, and of course it's war, and so it's not the best way we could live right now, but it's not the worst we have here. But still, it's war, it's bombing, and that's what we have.
And so in terms of getting hold of basic provisions like food or any other basic needs, are you still able to go out and do that?
Yeah, we're still able to go out and do that. We're able to get some basic stuff, but the medicine is a problem. The pharmacies don't have that much of things to offer, and that's a big problem for many people. And I know it's a kind of catastrophe in Mykolaiv region, so of course it's better in the city, but out of the city it's a lot worse.
And when the shelling starts, what is that like? How close is it to where you are?
It's that close that everything is shaking. It's very loud, and you don't know where to go, what to do. It's just, it feels like it's somewhere like 2 meters from where you're standing.
How does it make you feel when that happens?
How does it make me feel? Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yes. How?
So how can it make me feel? Of course, it's not something surprising. It's something I would never want anyone to experience. Everything is. I'm sorry, I'm nervous.
No, don't worry. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to understand. We're all trying to understand as we watch you around the world what you're going through, because obviously everyone's sympathies are with all those innocent victims of this war. I know that you're in the city. You must be fearing that it's going to get worse, that the war is going to come closer. Are you tempted to try to leave?
No, there is no way I'm going to leave. That's my country, which I love very much, and that's my home, and there is no way they make me leave. There is no way.
Even if the fighting comes very, very close?
Even if the fighting comes very, very close, I grab my Molotov cocktail and do my best to get one to the Russian.
You're young. You are willing to sacrifice your own life for this war?
If it makes better for my country. Of course, I do.
And your family that you're with, they all feel the same, do they?
Yeah, of course it's nervous for everyone. I cannot explain the extent of how nervous it is. It's war, and that's all I can say. So everyone doesn't feel good.
And if you have one message to people watching, to governments watching, what would you say that you, your people, your families, what do you want the outside world to do?
So first of all, I have an opportunity to say a big thank you for everyone who helps Ukraine, who help people who leave, who flee, and I see a lot of support from the UK, from Poland, and other countries. All countries do their best, I hope, and we all see that, and we are very thankful for what everyone does. What I would say, I'm no like political man to say something. I'm not sure if I can say something that would
you can carry on
be on that political level.
No, I
understand. Mean, what we need to, yeah, of course, we need weapon and etc. I'm just not sure if I can say things like that.
We understand. I know it must be very, very difficult. And just finally, in terms of keeping yourself so strong and staying as positive as you can, how are you coping? How are you managing to keep your own spirits up?
There is no staying positive. People dying every day, and every day my people who I know get their houses broken. So what kind of positivity do we have? None. So there is only just hope that we get through this war as soon as possible, and we get as a winner of this war, because there is no other way this war ends.
Well, we can hear the determination and the strength in your voice, and we wish you and your family all the very best. And thank you very much indeed for talking to us, and hopefully we can stay in touch with you. We hope that you all stay as safe as possible.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. That's Tasia, who is an IT consultant in normal, peaceful times living in Mykolaiv. Just want to bring you one other piece of news from another part of the world. North Korea has resumed long-range missile tests, including the launch of its largest ever weapon, a huge new intercontinental ballistic missile that was announced with an extraordinary video. Yeah, well, this is the North Korean state TV broadcast to promote the launch with the country's leader, Kim Jong-un, front and centre. As you can see, Kim says the launch is intended to show the world the power of his country's armed forces. This giant missile, called Hwasong-17, reached an altitude of 6,000 kilometres. It is the first intercontinental ballistic device to be tested by North Korea for 5 years. South Korea said it posed a serious threat and responded by carrying out its own missile tests. You're watching BBC News.
Hello there. Much of Europe is under the influence of a very big area of high pressure, so a lot of dry and sunny weather, as you can see here on the satellite picture. But this area of low pressure is continuing to bring a lot of very harsh conditions to Spain and Portugal. Now, we've continued with this very thick Sahara dust, so red skies, red atmosphere, in fact, across much of southern and eastern Spain in particular. Further heavy rainfall there, strong winds, pretty atrocious conditions, in fact. But the good news is this area of low pressure will be slowly easing through the weekend. A lot of dry and sunny weather across the southeast of Europe, much warmer across Greece and the Balkans than of late. We'll have this wet weather continuing to affect southern and eastern portions of Spain and the Balearics. Some sunshine starting to push into Portugal and northern Spain. But much of Central and Northern Europe will be fine and dry, plenty of sunshine. But we are looking at a change taking place across Scandinavia, in particular Finland, and across into the Baltic states. A deep low will be moving in here, and that'll bring some very cold conditions, very windy, with some heavy snowfall as we move through the weekend into next week. For London and for Paris, so the milder conditions continue through the weekend, but into next week we see something a bit chillier move down from the north. Madrid starts to see increasing amounts of sunshine as that low pressure clears away, and Athens will stay largely fine and settled with around average temperatures.
What we hope and pray that finally after 40 years the people of Afghanistan will have peace and stability.
My view of feminism is still really the same, which is that I think feminism is fundamentally a justice movement.
Africa will always remain important for me, and so I will continue doing what I do.
I could not have had a career as a gay man.
When big names talk, they talk to the BBC.
He's one of the most influential music producers with a career spanning 50 years. Join me here at his creative home of Abbey Road Studios for Amol Rajan interviews Nile Rodgers, here on BBC World News.
The Russians have been trying to advance here along Ukraine's Black Sea coast towards the major port city of Odessa. But so far, they're not making much progress. So, what are the Russians doing wrong and the Ukrainians getting right? Join me, Andrew Harding, here on BBC World News.
The cost of food is soaring and the war in Ukraine means its role as Europe's breadbasket is under pressure. So is there still enough to go around? Plus, here in Paris, Canada's Natural Resources Minister tells me if his country can help wean the world off Russian energy. Join me, Aaron Heselhurst, on Talking Business Weekly, here on BBC World News.
If you've got questions about the stories making headlines, Reality Check is here to help you get the facts straight. Our team of experts examine the evidence and cut through the spin. Join me, Chris Morris, here on BBC World News, or go to bbc.com/Reality Check.
We start at Wimbledon.
Stand by for a moment of history.
The headlines keep breaking.
The Winter Olympics.
Now to cricket.
The Tour de France.
The Africa Cup of Nations.
The debate keeps raging.
They're still the team to beat.
England's batting is weak.
It's going quite well.
Definitely a lot of disappointment.
The results keep coming.
What was going through your mind?
It was absolutely amazing.
My heart rate was up. It's part of the game.
This is a really tasty tie.
It's one of a kind.
This is Sport Today.
For all the latest results, headlines and analysis, Sport Today on BBC World News.
Now on BBC World News, veteran World Affairs editor John Simpson talks to BBC correspondents, going beyond the headlines for expert analysis of the week's major international news stories. Unspun World, with some scenes you may find upsetting.
Hello and welcome to Unspun World, where we ask the BBC's experts globally to explain what's going on in our world. This is the BBC's headquarters, new broadcasting house in London. Russia's war with Ukraine becomes more vicious and destructive by the week, and its effects are spreading wider and wider. Now it's starting to influence the nuclear talks with Iran.
At the last moment, we had this Ukrainian war and Russia suddenly sort of coming up with a new demand.
But what about the war which seems entirely forgotten? The war in Yemen, which has been going on for more than 7 years.
It's a horrific war and really catastrophic situation on the ground, and I find it very difficult to see how little interest there is into the war in Yemen.
The war in Ukraine has spread to the world of sport. Roman Abramovich's ownership of Chelsea Football Club is forcing Britain and other countries to face up to the question of billionaires seeking to sports wash their questionable money.
It's not a good look for the reputation of the Premier League or for its club. So there is a growing sense that something has to be done.
In Britain, briefly, the return of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe after 6 years of imprisonment in Iran took over the headlines from the war in Ukraine. But how is that war affecting the on-off deal between Iran, Russia and several Western countries dating back to 2015, which was intended to stop Iran enriching uranium for nuclear weapons? Can there be a return now to that agreement? I spoke to Kazra Naji of the BBC's Persian service.
The release of Nazanin and Anousheh Ashuri, the timing was interesting because it happened during a time when there is the nuclear negotiations have been suspended. We don't know when they're going to go back. And maybe the British government, the British side decided, okay, maybe this is the time to do it because the nuclear deal might not happen and maybe time has come to pay this debt to Iran and get them released.
The nuclear discussions. Tell us what happened with those. What's the problem there?
In 2015, Iran and 6 world powers agreed to a nuclear deal. The deal was for Iran to reduce the size of its nuclear activities, and for that, in 2016, these sanctions were lifted. Iran was back trading with the international community, with the outside world, until President Trump came to power in the US. He didn't like this deal at all, and he promised to pull out, and in fact he did. The result of that was that the Americans reimposed sanctions, and they called a new policy of maximum pressure on Iran, and the Iranians started going back to their nuclear program. We are now back to negotiations to revive that 2015 agreement. And they made quite a bit of progress until at the last moment we had this Ukrainian war and Russia suddenly sort of coming up with a new demand.
What was that demand, by the way?
The Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, made a speech in Moscow, out of blue, saying that we need any future relations with Iran, trade relations with Iran, to be exempted from the international sanctions against Russia. This was obviously beyond the scope of the nuclear talks. It had the potential of derailing the talks at the last minute, because 2 weeks ago when I was in Vienna, they were nearly there. They were, in fact, at one point they were planning to invite foreign ministers of the 5 powers to come to Vienna to sign this deal.
But that must irritate Iran, doesn't it?
Yes, very much so. Russian interest got in the way of a nuclear deal.
Let's look slightly more broadly about Iran's position in all of this. It hasn't really been in favor of the war, but it hasn't criticized Russia at all. And it is starting to edge its way towards both China and Russia in international affairs, isn't it? Away from any kind of Western links towards the East.
Iran has been looking to the East for some years now, probably best part of 15 years. The pressure from the United States and the West is so much, the sanctions, so on and so forth, that Iranians have decided that, okay, we're going to look to the East. Economic cooperation with China, cooperation with Russia, this is our policy. And that has been gaining strength over the years. What happens now in this new context of war in Ukraine is that that policy is being challenged now. And for Iran, the time has come to, in a sense, sort out its priorities vis-à-vis Russia. Also, there is an impact on China too, in a sense, because if in the nuclear talks Russia sticks to its demands, then there is fear that China might also support Russian position in the nuclear talks. So then we will have even a bigger problem. That suddenly Russia and China are not playing ball in the nuclear deal, and nuclear deal will collapse.
Western countries have devoted huge amounts of attention to the war in Ukraine, but this business of concentrating on some issues and ignoring others is something everybody does. With some honourable exceptions, for instance, the West has mostly ignored a war which is just as destructive as the one in Ukraine, but has been going on unchecked for 7 years. It's the war in Yemen, where Iran supports one side and Saudi Arabia the other. I asked Nawal Al-Maghafi, special correspondent for BBC Arabic, to explain this.
It's a horrific war and really catastrophic situation on the ground, John. And I ask myself that question all the time because I'm originally Yemeni and I find it very difficult to see how little interest there is into the war in Yemen. But I think the conclusion that I've come to is that it's so difficult to relate to a place that you've never visited, that you've never gone to on holiday. Yemen is so disconnected and is so far away.
And essentially it's a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, isn't it?
This war didn't start as a proxy war between the Saudis and the Iranians. This was a war that began because of frustrations on the ground after the Arab Spring. And it was effectively a coup. The president had to flee to the south, to Aden, and then he fled to Saudi Arabia, where he's been in exile ever since. And that's how the war first began. The coalition, led by Saudi Arabia, began its assault in March of 2015, effectively to reinstate the Yemeni government back into the capital Sana'a. But here we are at 2022, and the government is still in exile in Saudi Arabia.
How come neither side's been able to win?
I guess the Houthis actually see themselves as winners because over the course of the last 7 years, yes, we have the world's worst humanitarian crises. We have, a catastrophic situation on the ground, but they are stronger than they've ever been before, and they have control of the most populated part of the country, the north of Yemen. The bombing campaign, the blockade, people on the ground are seeing this as, they're seeing the coalition as foreign aggressors. And so they're joining and supporting the Houthis because they see them as the only national force on the ground that is fighting this foreign intervention.
Are there signs that the Saudis want to pull out, want to end the whole thing?
The Saudi coalition isn't willing to pull out in a way that makes them seem as losers in this war. They want to have some sort of face-saving deal. And that's why they've, the Gulf bloc proposed peace negotiations last week. But the Houthis refused because for them, the only way they can keep this narrative as being the national force on the ground that's fighting this foreign aggressor from the air is for this war to carry on.
So if the war comes to an end, essentially, even if the Houthis are seen to be the winners, they'll be the losers because they'll lose public support.
The Houthis have used this war as cover to basically hide a lot of the failures and mismanagement that they have on the ground. Right now, civil servants, doctors, teachers are not being paid salaries. When they question the authority of the Houthis, their response is, we're in a state of war. We can't pay salaries, we're in a state of war. When the average Yemeni needs to go and get petrol from a fuel station, they have to queue for 2 to 3 days to get fuel. The Houthis' response to that is, it's the blockade. We're in a state of war, so we can't do anything about that. There's no electricity in the entire north of the country, and their response to that is that we're in a state of war. As soon as this war ends, people are going to start asking questions.
Is there any chance that there can be a successful peace negotiation in Yemen?
Unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic, and I think actually the war in Ukraine impacts Yemen and means the situation in Yemen is going to be even worse, because Yemen relies on Ukrainian wheat for 80% of the wheat that goes to the country.
And any sign, any chance, any hope of peace?
Not in the near future.
The UN says it expects 4 million people to have left Ukraine by July and more than 6.5 million people to be internally displaced. These are horrendous figures, and for many Ukrainians it's the second time in 8 years that Russian invasions have created these huge waves of refugees after the seizure of Crimea from Ukraine back in 2014. Yana Lyushnevskaya, a Ukrainian specialist for BBC Monitoring, now lives in Poland. She's been a refugee twice over, once when she left Crimea and now the second time when she escaped from Kiev.
And there are many of people like me who left Crimea either before or after the annexation, who have, built a life for themselves in Kiev or any other city in Ukraine. So they already had to leave their home once, and then after a few years, after working very hard to get a flat, to get a job, and now it's happening all over again. It is heartbreaking.
Do you think it's going to be possible for Ukrainians to forgive Russia for what it's done in any kind of short time at all?
I don't think it's possible in the short term, especially because of the way many Russians responded to this war. I'm talking about instances which have been publicized a lot, where people from Ukraine call their friends or relatives in Russia saying like, "Oh my God, do you see what is happening? We are being under attack." But then the people in Russia would say heartbreaking things like, "It's not us. Russian troops are only targeting, military facilities. They're not targeting civilians. It's your Nazi troops shelling themselves." This is something that is very hard to forgive, to be honest.
What do you think is acceptable to people? They've lost Crimea. Is it acceptable for President Zelensky to say, okay, we accept we've lost that? Or would that be unacceptable to people?
The key narrative in Ukraine since 2014 has been that Crimea is part of Ukraine, just like Donbass. And to be honest, I'm from Crimea myself, and I know how important Crimea is to Ukrainians. There is a significant sentimental value that Crimea has among Ukrainians. And we need to remember that, even among Russian-speaking Ukrainians, those that may have had some sort of pro-Russian views in the past, there is a lot of hatred that many Ukrainians feel towards Russia, and President Zelensky would have to think about that when he is engaged in those negotiations with Russia.
Well, it sounds as though it'll be quite difficult for him to make too many concessions.
I would say so, especially, for example, when it comes to Ukraine's NATO aspirations, which it may, be forced to give up. Ukraine's bid to join NATO is enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution, so it is going to be very tricky.
Now, you're in Poland, where there are at least, I think, 1.5 million Ukrainian refugees, perhaps more.
About what they feel about this war. So the West is accepting the largest part of the refugees coming from Ukraine. So the people that I've spoken to here are all pretty unanimous in their views. They see Russia as an aggressor.
In past wars, Bosnia, for instance, plenty of people try to undermine the credibility of us or ringing into chat shows. Not any longer. So the BBC has a reporter, Mariana Spring, whose job it is to watch over social media and questions of disinformation.
Millions of followers, and he posted on Instagram and TikTok about his house, his apartment block, which had been bombed. He was greeted by hundreds of comments from pro-Russia trolls telling him, "You're lying, it's not true, this didn't happen." And that kind of disinformation effort and trolling we've seen happening across the social media sites, and it's one that the social media sites have been playing catch up with. A lot of the major platforms have done quite well at getting on top of this disinformation, but when it comes to sites like TikTok, and then also Telegram, which is a messaging app similar to a mixture between Facebook and WhatsApp. When it comes to those, we've noticed that they've been slower at taking down and tackling this kind of content. And so you've seen, particularly on TikTok, how pro-Russia accounts that promote falsehoods about how the war is staged, or even that crisis actors might be involved, have gone particularly viral. But when I've got in touch with them about it, they've told us that they are investing more in tackling disinformation on their sites.
It's interesting what you say, because I remember 30 years ago, the siege of Sarajevo, and we would go out, there'd be a bomb would land, or a mortar or something would hit perhaps an bunch of people, saying, these are just mannequins out of shop windows, these are actors. This all seems to be happening again 30 years later.
It definitely is happening, and around Mariupol in particular, we've seen several of these tactics deployed in order to suggest that some of the most shocking events, particularly the bombing of the maternity hospital and also the bombing of the theatre, didn't happen as evidence would suggest, and that they are somehow staged. And you can't think of something that's more distressing, particularly for the individuals who have been hurt and who are victims of this violence, to be told that, no, you're part of a plot, this isn't happening, you are actually, you're being paid. Another theme that's come up quite a lot is that actually nowadays there are quite a lot of people whose job it is, including in Ukraine or in Russia, to be influencers, beauty influencers. And we saw around the bombing of the maternity hospital that there was one woman who is a beauty influencer, who's also called Mariana, like me, who was accused of acting, of staging this attack, of pretending to be injured, because they said, oh, look, she's a pregnant beauty blogger. We know, she has form at being able to pose in front of the camera.
Is this government influenced, or is it coming just from individuals?
You can begin to understand how something that pops up on a Telegram channel, a pro-Kremlin Telegram channel, will then be picked up by state media and also by even government sources.
So you get the interaction of the ordinary people and the state. It's quite a difficult thing to counter.
If you're constantly told the same thing, not just for several hours or months, but years and years, you can see how you are very susceptible to the kinds of narratives that are being pushed by your media or by the government. And we've certainly seen that playing out in Russia. You see how that same narrative plays out, this idea that Ukraine is somehow attacking itself and Russia is not responsible for the harm being caused. But I also think it's actually trying to make sense of something that's almost too big and too horrible to get your head around, to think, could someone really do that?
Isn't it a relatively small proportion of people who are convinced by the pictures they see and so forth?
There's not only information campaigns that occur prior to that, where Russia is trying to set a certain narrative around what's happening and who's guilty of what, but we see them in reaction to those events as well. And they stop us being able to figure out what's happening on the ground. They stop us being able to work out who's suffering and who's harmed and who's been hurt by whom. It really affects those who are being targeted, those who are being told that what they're living isn't what they're living, and the truth of what's happening in Ukraine. What does that mean for Russia? What does that mean going forward?
It's extraordinary to see how the Ukraine crisis has spread out across. Bought Chelsea Football Club and pumped so much money into it that the English Premier League was transformed. Football clubs has become immensely important. Dan Rowan, the BBC's sports editor.
Well, the Premier League, any human rights provision. What we've seen is that these rules do not prevent sovereign wealth funds, for example, for over Chelsea. What this huge controversy and the unprecedented circumstances that Chelsea now face has done, more than any other issue.
Have owners from certain countries, when often it's the richest countries that have the worst record, isn't it?
Well, certainly if you look at the likes of Saudi Arabia and Newcastle United, as we've mentioned, but also Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Mansour, who is the brother of the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi. He's also the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates. He effectively owns Manchester City. And you only need to look at the level of investment it's created jobs and regeneration. So some argue that there is definitely a positive side to all this. And of course, what these clubs are doing is merely reflecting the wider policy of the government when it comes to inward investment and trade as well. And so many would argue that it would be wrong or unfair to expect football to reject such opportunities for investment. Chelsea's in limbo right now. Its owner has been disqualified. It's been frozen as an asset. Now Newcastle United fans supportive of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, given the human rights issues that he stands accused of right now. And so this is not a good look for the reputation of the Premier League or for its club. So there is a growing sense that something has to be done.
I'm a Chelsea supporter. I follow a team which has gone shooting up right up to the top of the league, which has won endless awards and cups and competitions. And it's because of Roman Abramovich. He actually changed the nature of English football, didn't he?
Yes, he was undoubtedly a game changer, John. I think in terms of the level of expenditure, but also in terms of the profile of the league. Now, you now have a situation where the British government have accused Abramovich of being a pro-Kremlin oligarch, of having very close ties to Putin, and the motivation for him buying into Chelsea. And it leaves Chelsea fans like you, John, with a very uncomfortable fear, I suspect, which is that your club may have been used for sports washing.
Dan Rowan, the BBC sports editor. As the war in Ukraine drags on, with Ukrainian forces defending their country far more effectively than Vladimir Putin and his military leaders expected, Russian tactics become even fiercer and more devastating, nastier and more destructive weapons to try to force Ukraine to its knees.
It was far noisier, much louder. Across the border into a sovereign nation.
Hello there. The temperatures have been well above the seasonal norm across much of California and the Great Basin. Widespread sunshine, interior winds here, though not quite as hot as it has been as we head on into the weekend. Still dry and sunny, mind you. The eastern side of the United States, southeast Canada, also seeing a slight improvement in the corner of North America. This area of low pressure has brought all sorts of problems to sunshine. There's a lot of sunshine across Europe thanks to high pressure. It's turning much colder, wetter and windier across Scandinavia and to the Baltic states. This area of low pressure, which has brought the dust and the heavy rain to Spain, slowly weakening as it pushes its way eastwards towards Italy over the weekend. This area of low pressure, which also brought the wet weather to Morocco and Algeria, as it pulls away, we'll see increasing amounts of sunshine there, so improvements for both Saturday and Sunday there. The Middle East will be brighter for both Saturday and Sunday. South Asia, a lot of dry and settled weather, turning hotter across northern India. Still the chance of a few showers breaking out across the Western Ghats and into Sri Lanka. And as we move through Sunday, this area of low pressure continues to bring some thundery downpours to the northeast of New Zealand. Elsewhere, it'll be fine and settled.
As the coronavirus pandemic continues, BBC News has in-depth coverage.
It's the information from labs like these that will aid policymakers.
Happen with breaking news alerts in the app and get the full story with bbc.com/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.
This is BBC News. I'm Ben Brown, live in Lviv here in western Ukraine. And Ukrainian forces are reoccupying some of the towns east of the capital, Kyiv, according to the UK Ministry of Defence. President Biden has arrived in Poland. He's been telling US troops stationed there, not far from the Ukrainian border, that they are fighting for the freedom of generations still to come. A Russian defense official signals what could be a major shift in Moscow's military focus east towards the disputed Donbass region. Hello, welcome from the city of Lviv here in western Ukraine. Well, as the war in this country grinds on into a second bloody month, Ukrainian forces are continuing to counteract and counterattack the Russian invasion, seizing back lost control around the capital, Kyiv. As we've known for some time now, the war is not going to President Putin's plan. The concern is what the Russian president could do next if he feels backed into a corner. And there are fears he could even use chemical weapons. Well, in a show of strength and unity between NATO members, President Biden has arrived today for talks in Poland. Air Force One landed at Rzeszów in the southeast of the country, around an hour from the border with Ukraine. He was greeted by the Polish Foreign Minister and the US Ambassador to Poland before holding talks with the Polish President. Mr. Biden's also been meeting some of the 10,000 American troops stationed in southeastern Poland and spoke of the importance of their presence in Eastern Europe.
You're in the midst of a fight between democracies and oligarchs. Xi Jinping, who I've spent more time with, they tell me, than any other world leader, points out to me he believes in China that democracies can't succeed in the 21st century. The reason is things are moving so fast, change is happening so quickly that democracies require consensus, and we can't put together consensus as quickly as autocrats can. So what's at stake, not just in what we're doing here in Ukraine to try to help the Ukrainian people and keep the massacre from continuing, but beyond that, what's at stake is what are your kids and grandkids going to look like in terms of their freedom?
Well, that's President Biden, and our correspondent Dan Johnson is in southeastern Poland, from where he joins us right now. Dan, just tell us what the president is doing today exactly, and what is the significance symbolically of this visit to Poland today?
It's hugely significant, hugely symbolic that Air Force One, the US President, the United States flag has been planted firmly on the ground here, very close to the Ukrainian border today. The President has met US troops who are stationed here, about 10,000 of them now in Poland, close to the border with Ukraine, but he's also met some of the volunteers, the humanitarian aid workers who've been on the front line of the refugee crisis that has resulted from the conflict in Ukraine. Poland is the country that's taken more Ukrainian refugees than any other. 2.2 million have crossed the border since the invasion began. So President Biden saw some of that work in action. He spoke to some of the Ukrainian refugees, but he is also meeting with the Polish President Andrzej Duda. And although Air Force One is just taxiing away here from Rzeszów Airport, it's about to take off, but it is only flying to the capital, Warsaw, where those talks will continue. The two presidents in discussion about what more they can do to work closely together to show support for Ukraine, to bolster the resistance and the defense of that country, to deal with the refugee crisis that has resulted from the Russian military action in Ukraine, and also to reassure people in this country and in other countries in Eastern Europe, because there has been concern about what has been happening just over the border, not just the pressure that has been put on cities, authorities, services here because of the amount of people fleeing the war, but also genuine concern about the possibility of Russian attacks, either accidentally or deliberately, spilling over the border and affecting people here. I've spoken to Polish people in the last couple of weeks who've been genuinely scared that they may get embroiled in this conflict, and that's partly because of the history that this country has endured, the trauma that it has been through in the past, and the fact that people here, although a generation has now lived here without war, people are always aware that it is something they've been through in the past and something that is coming closer to them now. So I think President Biden is here to make a firm statement that he is in solidarity and support not just with the people of Ukraine, but with the people of Poland and other Eastern European nations. This country is already increasing its defense spending. It's going up from 2.2% to 3% of GDP. We've seen more people volunteering for the Polish Territorial Defence Force. That gives you some idea of the sorts of concerns that people have in the population here, because the conflict is so close to them. I think that is Air Force One just taking off here from Rzeszów Airport. But as I say, it's only about a 45 or 50-minute flight to Warsaw, where the talks between President Biden and President Duda will continue into the evening.
All right, Dan, thank you very much indeed. Dan Johnson there for us with the very latest from Poland. Well, in what could signify a big shift in strategy, a top Russian general has suggested that Moscow's initial goals in Ukraine have mostly been achieved, and it will now focus on the eastern regions of the country. Sergei Russко of the Armed Forces General Staff said his forces would focus on the main goal of liberating the Donbass in the east of Ukraine, while our security correspondent Frank Gardner analyses the Russian assault so far, 1 month after the invasion, and what the Russian options are right now.
Well, we're now into the second month of this Russian invasion of Ukraine, and much of the battle picture hasn't really changed that much. But the majority of the fighting is taking place in the east of the country, around here, Lugansk and Donetsk. And this is where Russian forces are making some progress. They're pushing back the regular Ukrainian army units. We don't hear very much about that part of the war. There isn't a lot of reporting coming from it. A lot of the destruction has been around the port of Mariupol here. Russian forces have now reached the center of that city, but there are around 100,000 plus civilians still trapped in it. And some of the defenders there are some of the most die-hard Ukrainian defenders who are going to fight right to the end, as many Ukrainians are. They're refusing to surrender, they're not prepared to be captured, and they're going to fight to the death. The reason why that's so important is for Russia to link up its forces from Crimea here all the way through to their pro-Kremlin separatist republic allies in the east, which would give them a land corridor. What they also want to do is to try to take the port of Odessa over there. And that's why they're moving westwards towards the port, towards the town of Mykolaiv. Now, Odessa is busy defending itself. It's tying down quite a large number of Ukrainian troops in preparation for any kind of Russian assault. Finally, in the north, up here, Kyiv, it's pretty much a stalemate. The Ukrainians have managed to retake some small areas, such as the town of Makariv, where the Ukrainian flag has been seen flying there, and they've been able to push back Russian artillery at least 15, 20, some cases 35 kilometers from the city. Otherwise, the picture hasn't changed a great deal from a week ago. So the big question is, where does all this leave President Vladimir Putin? Because this is very much his war. He didn't even share the intimate plans of it with many of his associates. Those plans included capturing the capital, Kyiv, early on, forcing a resignation of the government, and putting in place a new government that would be sympathetic to Moscow. Well, that clearly hasn't happened. Ukraine has defied the odds, it's held on. So now there is a fear in Western capitals that in order to break the stalemate that much of this invasion has ground down to, that Russia is going to try something really dramatic and escalatory, such as using chemical or biological weapons. There's no proof so far that Russia is planning to do it, but that's the fear in the West.
Well, that's Frank Gardner. Let's get more now on that breaking news in the last couple of hours, coming from a senior Russian commander, talking about how the Russian campaign is now going to focus very much on the east, on the Donbass region. We can talk to our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams, who's got more on this. And Paul, what does this suggest? That perhaps they're going to give up on taking control of the capital, Kyiv, and other parts of Ukraine?
Ben, I think it's way too early to conclude anything quite so broad as that. Clearly, as you just heard, the effort around Kyiv seems to be stalled. There are reports of the Russians digging defensive positions, suggesting that they're prepared to wait it out for a while. And I think what this does indicate is that perhaps a growing realization in Moscow that its pre-war planning, which was for a lightning attack on Ukraine along multiple fronts, simply has not worked. And that maybe what they need to be doing is concentrating on one objective at a time. And clearly the objective of what they describe as liberating the Donbass, that is securing those two separatist-held areas in the east and extending the boundaries of that territory and linking that with this land corridor along the Sea of Azov to the Crimean Peninsula. Those are really the kind of core primary war objectives, and that perhaps now we're going to see them concentrating on those objectives while pausing elsewhere.
And in terms of those more limited objectives, if that's what they are, how close do you think the Russian military are to realising those objectives?
Well, Mariupol does remain a problem for them in the south. Without the port of Mariupol, that land corridor between Crimea and the Donbass is tenuous, to say the least. So that's one issue they have to resolve. The other is that in the east, facing those separatist republics, are some of Ukraine's best forces. They've been stationed there throughout. They are battle hardened. They have been on those front lines for the past 8 years during that campaign in the Donbass. And so it has been widely believed by Western officials that isolating and surrounding and cutting off those Ukrainian forces is a major objective of the Russian military. And without achieving that objective, perhaps none of the rest of it can really be achieved. So what we seem to be hearing from Moscow today is an awareness that it is those forces that they need to be concentrating on now. We're told that an additional 10 Russian battle groups are being directed to that front, and that will be the concentration, the effort that they're going to concentrate on for the time being. I think this is really the message from this, one objective at a time.
Very interesting, Paul. Good to talk to you. Thank you so much. That's Paul Adams there, our diplomatic correspondent. And certainly Ukrainian forces appear to be buoyed up by their apparent success, according to British military intelligence, in counter-attacking successfully targets east of the capital, Kyiv, recapturing some towns and some lost territory up to 20 miles east of the capital. That's the latest from here in western Ukraine. I'll hand you back to the studio in London.
Ben Brown and team in Lviv, thank you very much indeed. Well, as we've been hearing, the siege of the southern Ukrainian city of Mariupol has entered its second month, yet the people of the city have held out despite a lack of food, water and electricity. In one of the grimmest moments of the conflict so far, authorities there say they believe around 300 people may have died when Russia bombed the local theatre last week, where civilians were taking shelter, including many children. Officials say their assessment is based on witness accounts, but it can't be independently verified. Our correspondent, Wira Davis, reports from behind the front lines in southern Ukraine.
Sergei scans the endless flatlands of southern Ukraine, the rich, fertile farmland that Russia wants for itself. The 62-year-old former fire engine driver never envisaged taking up arms against the might of Moscow, but he knows full well what the Russian army is capable of doing.
We can't see Mariupol, but we know what's happening there, and we must not let that happen here. These people know that we are here for them.
These are the last Ukrainian defensive lines in the south, before the front line a couple of kilometres away. And of course, all the while, Russia continues to shell and bomb the city of Mariupol just down the road. The big question here is, what does Russia do next? And here they say they are armed and ready. Towns and villages across the region are targets for Russian artillery. The bombs are getting close. Nowhere in the south is really safe. But there are few words to describe the horrors inflicted on Mariupol and the 100,000 people trapped inside the city. A catastrophic landscape shredded by Russian artillery. Starving residents emerging from shelters queue for food. New footage too from last week's theatre attack in which 300 people died, according to Ukrainian officials. There's no shortage of volunteers and reservists wanting to avenge what's happening in Mariupol.
Many of our fighters come from places that are currently under Russian occupation. All of them have parents, wives and families there. So each one of us is determined to win back our lands as soon as possible.
But there's a reason these men are training underground in an undisclosed location. One thing they've learned in the last month is that the sky is full of Russian drones trying to spot their every move. Several military training facilities are reported to have been hit by Russian fire. The road to Mariupol is fraught with dangers, but it's a road and a destination pivotal to how this war pans out. Woodrow Davis, BBC News, Southern Ukraine.
Well, the United Nations says that Ukrainians are being arbitrarily detained and subjected to enforced disappearances in Russian-controlled areas. At least 36 cases of civilian detentions were verified by the UN, with families often denied any information about the fate of those being held. Amongst them are a number of Ukrainian journalists and emergency workers. Mathilde Bodnier is the head of the UN's Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and she joins me now from Western Ukraine. Thank you very much for speaking to us. What do we know about the disappearances that the UN has been able to verify?
Oh, thank you for talking to us about this important issue. We have been documenting cases of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances of several different groups of people in Ukraine. We're starting to see different patterns developing since the armed attack by the Russian Federation has taken place. What we've seen is that in areas that have been taken over by Russian forces, they have specifically targeted two different groups of people. One are local officials. So you will have heard of the arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances of mayors and other local government officials that have been taken. We have documented 22 cases of local government officials. Out of those cases, at least 13 have since been released, but the others remain disappeared. We've also been documenting the cases of journalists and local civic activists, 15 of whom have been arbitrarily detained and forcefully disappeared. Out of those, we have now some information that 8 of those have since been released.
It's obviously a terrifying move for them and their families. Do we know why some people are then released?
It's hard to say exactly what the motivation is behind who they release and who they don't release. We understand that they are being targeted for their apparent pro-Ukrainian views, and this is probably a way to try to control those who want to publicly express their support for Ukraine. But we're not sure exactly why some are released and others are not.
And do you have any idea whether people are being held in Ukraine or taken to Russia, whether they're all even alive?
My understanding is that they have been held in areas close to where they have been detained. We have no information that these people have been taken to Russia. Obviously, those who remain disappeared, we don't know their fate. And that is one of the awful aspects of enforced disappearances, is that there is no information. And relatives, they can spend... They spend all of their time looking for those that they love who have been disappeared. And until they appear again, they have no idea what has happened to them.
And when you talk about mayors, journalists, civil society activists, obviously there are so many of those throughout the country. Any idea, again, why some are targeted, or is it just a question of whoever the Russians can trace?
Certainly, this is only in areas where the Russian Federation has taken full control. So in areas where hostilities are more active, we have not documented these cases. But exactly why they choose one or another, we're not sure. But they have been targeting those who are more vocal about their opinions in terms of supporting Ukraine.
And is it having a chilling effect? Are people starting to think about not speaking out as much, or being more careful about what they say, what they post, how they operate?
Certainly, a pattern that we have been documenting is that people in these areas that have been taken over by Russian forces, are more and more afraid to talk to us and to talk to others about the situations that they are facing. So this certainly does have a chilling effect. It does make the population less willing to talk to people outside of those areas.
Matilda Bonnier, head of the UN monitoring mission there. Thank you so much for joining us there live in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, to the UK now. Ukrainian refugees escaping to the UK are facing difficulties getting visas under the government's Homes for Ukraine scheme, according to charities here. Mark and Heather Easton are trying to help the woman who is the surrogate mother to their daughter. They say they're locked in a bureaucratic battle to help her and her family come to the UK. Phil Mackey went to meet them.
In December, Mark and Heather Easton arrived in Kiev to await the birth of their daughter and to meet their surrogate, Vita. By the time Sophie was born in January, they knew a Russian invasion could be imminent. After a frantic few weeks, they got Sophie an emergency passport and they came home to Rugby, less than a fortnight before the tanks rolled in. As soon as they get permission. After 8 years of trying and 6 failed IVF treatments, Mark and Heather finally have the baby daughter they've longed for. Now they're desperate to help Vita and her family escape the war.
We just think she's wonderful. She gave us Sophie. She basically saved me. I was in an immense amount of grief from infertility, and she's put a smile on my face. And we're just trying to save her, basically. She doesn't know anybody else really outside of Ukraine.
She's never been anywhere, has she?
She's never left Ukraine.
No.
So we're her lifeline to say, come here and we'll help you.
When we said goodbye in Ukraine to Vita, I says to her, oh, this isn't goodbye, you know, just saying it like that, you know.
It isn't goodbye,
This isn't goodbye, we're always going to be friends, sort of thing. And here we are.
That's going to go outside the tumble dryer. It's going to be a little shed built for it.
The Eastons are trying to raise money to help Vita and her family when they get here, and there's already been a lot of generosity. Steve Walsh, who lives just 5 minutes away, has offered to host them in his ground floor flat.
So, yes, it wasn't meant for 3 people. However, needs must. Yeah.
Vita, her husband Andriy, her son Nazar and their dog Muzzy, who wasn't interested in appearing on screen, are currently staying in a hotel in Brussels waiting for their paperwork. We managed to talk to her on a video call with the help of a Ukrainian translator who I called on my phone. Vita told us that her hometown is being bombed every day. That's why she decided to leave. She's grateful and is really looking forward to coming here.
Yeah, it's really great to see you, Vita, and Nazar and Andrea. And I presume Musa's there somewhere. We can't wait to have you, and hopefully, fingers crossed, a few more days, or come on, government, let you in.
The Easterns know that Vita and her family are safe, but wish the government would speed the application process up.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Just frustrated with the government, basically, that they're making them dot the I's and cross the T's, and rather than just letting them come in and then process them here. I think they've been through enough. They don't need this to be dragged out.
Baby Sophie doesn't realise yet how much drama has been packed into her first 7 weeks. Phil Mackey, BBC News, Rugby.
Just to bring you the latest breaking lines on the Ukrainian situation, Reuters reporting that the Turkish President Erdogan has discussed the latest situation in the war and the stage reached in talks in a phone call with President Zelensky. That's come from the Turkish presidency. And also it's been reported from the Ukrainian side that they're saying no one is going to surrender Mariupol. There have been differing accounts about the progress of talks, but those are the latest lines coming into us. You're watching BBC News. Thanks for being with us.
Hello there. Much of Europe is under the influence of a very big area of high pressure, so a lot of dry and sunny weather, as you can see here on the satellite picture. But this area of low pressure is continuing to bring a lot of very harsh conditions to Spain and Portugal. Now, we've continued with this very thick Sahara dust, so red skies, red atmosphere, in fact, across much of southern and eastern Spain in particular. Further heavy rainfall there, strong winds, pretty atrocious conditions, in fact. But the good news is this area of low pressure will be slowly easing through the weekend. A lot of dry and sunny weather across the southeast of Europe, much warmer across Greece and the Balkans than of late. We'll have this wet weather continuing to affect southern and eastern portions of Spain and the Balearics. Some sunshine starting to push into Portugal and northern Spain, but much of Central and Northern Europe will be fine and dry, plenty of sunshine. But we are looking at a change taking place across Scandinavia, in particular Finland, and across into the Baltic states. A deep low will be moving in here, and that'll bring some very cold conditions, very windy, with some heavy snowfall as we move through the weekend into next week. For London and for Paris, so the milder conditions continue through the weekend, but into next week we see something a bit chillier move down from the north. Madrid starts to see increasing amounts of sunshine as that low pressure clears away, and Athens will stay largely fine and settled with around average temperatures.
How worried is the WHO?
We really need to focus on bringing transmission down.
You've been in office for some time. What are you doing about it?
This question is without context.
What the turnout was, it was over 70%. You know how many seats your party got? 0, Ms.
Yes, we failed to win seats, but we got more votes than previous election.
It's a risk you're taking.
I take risks every day.
The reason you haven't divorced is that you simply can't afford it.
You're right about that.
Hard Talk on BBC World News.
Mykolaiv is a city of nearly 500,000 people. Every night, curfew and total blackout. This is the hour when nobody else is allowed on the street, yeah?
Yeah.
This is one of the men in charge of defending the city, the mayor, Alexander Senkevich. Usually dressed in a suit and tie, he's now permanently armed.
Oof.
Was that incoming or outgoing?
Sounds like outgoing. So, this is my office.
Mayor Alexander has one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. Other mayors have been targeted by Russian forces, abducted and even killed.
Every time I go out, I think this is my last time.
Belarusian side, migrants started throwing rocks and bricks and branches towards the Polish forces.
A week of commemorative events in honor of Archbishop Tutu is well underway all over South Africa.
There's more trouble here in the Netherlands. Small groups of people destroying things in the northern city of Groningen.
The clashes are taking place just a few hundred meters away from where I'm standing now. You can hear the sound of shooting and explosions.
This is a storm that has now claimed at least 14 lives overnight. You had people rushing to their basements.
We break stories from more places than any other international news broadcaster. We are the leaders in global breaking news.
This is BBC News. Welcome if you're watching here in the UK or around the globe. I'm Geeta Gurumurthy. Our top stories. A senior Russian defense official has said Moscow will now focus its main efforts in Ukraine on the Donbas region, in what Western officials see as an acknowledgement of failure so far. President Biden is in Poland, where he's been telling US troops stationed not far from the Ukraine border that they're fighting for the freedom of generations still to come.
What's at stake is what are your kids and grandkids going to look like in terms of their freedom.
And the United States and European Union announced a major deal on liquefied natural gas in an attempt to cut Europe's reliance on Russian energy supplies. More on all of those stories in a moment, but first let's have a little break from Ukraine and all the other news worldwide. Let's catch up with Lizzie and all the sport. Hi there, Lizzie.
Hello,
Hello there, thank you. We're starting with cricket. It's day 2 of the final and decisive test between England and West Indies in Grenada. After a turgid opening hour, England's bowlers seem to have found the key to the dangers of the pitch, which caused their batting collapse the day before. They just scraped to 204 in their first innings. In reply, West Indies have just lost another wicket. They're 95 for 6. Ben Stokes with the breakthrough wicket of captain Craig Brathwaite, then Craig Overton, Saqib Mahmood and Chris Wokes with 3 now. So far, England are searching for their first series win in the Caribbean for 18 years. Well, at the Women's Cricket World Cup, Australia continue to dominate, this time with a victory over Bangladesh, keeping their 100% record in the group stages. The Aussies were given a bit of a scare, though, chasing 136 to win. They lost their first 3 wickets for just 26 runs. But Beth Mooney and Annabelle Sutherland combined for 76 to lead their team to a 5-wicket victory. As group winners, they'll meet the 4th-place team in the quarter-finals. Now, he called it the biggest disappointment of his career, but Roberto Mancini was reluctant to discuss his future as Italy manager after his side's shock World Cup qualifying exit to North Macedonia last night. Just 8 months after winning the European Championship, Italy were beaten 1-0 in their playoff semi-final. Veteran defender Giorgio Chiellini said they were crushed, but he admitted that he'd been poor throughout qualifying, or rather the team had been poor. Well, huge delight for the victors there. These were the scenes in Skopje, the capital of North Macedonia, as fans celebrated. They have one more hurdle to overcome, a playoff final against Portugal, as they bid to reach the World Cup for the first time. Well, for the Italians, it's a case of history repeating itself after they also failed to get to the last World Cup in Russia. Come the 2026 finals, assuming they make it, the Azzurri and their fans will have been without World Cup football for 12 years. Here's Conor Clancy, editor-in-chief of Forza Italian Football.
There is disappointment, but not the same shock here as seems to be being felt outside of Italy, because, yeah, they're the European champions, but they are Italy. They make things complicated for themselves. When they're supposed to be good, they're very much not. And we've unfortunately seen that again this year.
Elsewhere in the playoffs, Wales are just 1 match away from a first World Cup in 64 years. Captain Gareth Bale was the driving force in their 2-1 win over Austria in Cardiff, scoring both Wales's goals. They still have a final against Scotland or Ukraine to come later in the year. Elsewhere, Portugal survived a scare to beat Turkey 3-1 to set up that playoff final with North Macedonia. Turkey missed a late penalty with the score at 2-1. And substitute Robin Quaison scored the winner for Sweden in extra time against the Czech Republic as they won their semi-final 1-0. Well, meanwhile, the human rights records of the nation hosting the World Cup continue to be questioned. And while England manager Gareth Southgate says he doesn't see the benefit of boycotting this year's tournament in Qatar, he did confirm that his team are having their own conversations in the camp about what they may be able to do.
There's power in us being able to do something together, or maybe even with some of the other European nations, or whatever that might look like. So there's conversations going on all the time in the background, and it would be wrong to say we're just pushing things to one side. It's frankly, we're talking more about it than many other things. So, but I agree. I think the players have got a good voice. We should allow them to come up with their ideas. If we can support that and help shape that, then we also want to do that.
It's the Saudi Arabian Formula One Grand Prix this weekend. Second practice has been delayed due to a fire near the circuit in Jeddah. But the country's human rights is also under the spotlight, and the 6-time world champion Lewis Hamilton says it should be easy for Saudi Arabia to make changes. The Mercedes driver said it was mind-blowing to hear some of the stories about abuses in Saudi Arabia. The regime has been accused of using events such as Grand Prix to sports wash its reputation. Well, you can find out what happened in practice and the reason for that delay to second practice on the BBC Sport website. But that's it from me for now.
Lizzie, thanks very much indeed. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has had a frank and candid discussion, apparently, with China's President Xi Jinping about the situation in Ukraine. That's according to Downing Street. The call came after NATO leaders urged Beijing to abstain from supporting Russia's war effort and to refrain from any actions that would help it circumvent sanctions. Our political correspondent Helen Catt had the latest.
This happened this morning, as we understand it. It's the first time since November, I think, that the two men have spoken. It lasted, some reports say 50 minutes, others an hour, so around that sort of length of time. And as you said, what we're told is from Downing Street is that it was a frank and candid conversation. Some of the bits that we do know that they spoke about were, for example, the Prime Minister again expressing his sympathy with the victims of the flight that crashed in China last week. President Xi asking the Prime Minister to convey his best wishes to the Queen on her Jubilee. Beyond that, we're told that they discussed a range of issues of mutual interest, which did include the situation in Ukraine. Now, as if they were discussing, for example, the possibility of sanctions on China, if China were to aid Russia. We're told that wasn't planned to be in the conversation, but we're told that the Prime Minister put forward the UK's position on Ukraine and his belief that that pressure should be put on President Putin to withdraw his troops.
And Helen, it's obviously been a very busy couple of days on the diplomatic front. Boris Johnson meeting other EU leaders and President Biden, but then excluded from that final meeting, it seems. And I also see that obviously there's been a lot of concern about any sort of chemical weapon use. Has there been some briefing on those concerns?
Well, obviously, we know, as you said, that diplomatic efforts continue throughout this. Boris Johnson has said that what they want is to isolate Russia, and we've certainly seen him upping the pressure on China in recent days to do that. We've seen other world leaders do that too. At the weekend, Boris Johnson spoke about it being a considerable dilemma for countries who wanted to continue to stand apart from this. He specifically referenced China, saying that I think in Beijing you're starting to see some second thoughts. And of course, that is really what Western leaders want, is for China not even to stay neutral, but to come out and criticise President Putin's actions.
Helen and Kat there. Well, as we've been reporting, President Biden has been to visit troops on the Polish border with Ukraine. My colleague Ben Brown, who's in Lviv, spoke to the MEP and former Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski and asked him what message President Biden's visit to Poland sends to Russia.
I think recognition also that just as President Putin was threatening Ukraine before, so he's now threatening NATO and Poland in particular. And I think it's a signal to him not even to think about breaching NATO borders. Those American troops, we now have about 10,000 in Poland, are also a strong signal, all good and well.
How worried do you think people in Poland are by what's happening in Ukraine and the Russian invasion a month ago?
Well, we are particularly worried about this Russian doctrine of escalate to de-escalate, which is what they exercise in their military maneuvers, which involves using tactical nuclear weapons. And I think when President Biden talks about chemical, it's actually code for weapons of mass destruction in general. We need to deter President Putin from even thinking about it.
Is there solidarity, do you believe, in NATO, in the Western military alliance, when it comes to helping Ukraine in this war against Russia, particularly when it comes to helping with weapon supplies? We've heard President Zelensky say time and time again he needs more weapons, he needs more military support from NATO.
I think weapons are getting through, mostly through Poland and Romania. NATO is trying to steer a line between helping Ukraine without being drawn into the war ourselves. And I think that is the correct approach.
And let's just talk about this incredible influx of refugees into Poland. More than 2 million people, and they have been welcomed with open arms there. I mean, it is a huge influx of people. What are your thoughts about the months and maybe even the years ahead? What is going to happen to those people?
They have mostly been received into Polish homes. And, you know, our attitude is that since Ukrainians are fighting for Europe, for democracy, for freedom, they are fighting our fight. The least we can do is to take care of their women and children. There will be challenges, though. Eventually, they will have to leave private homes and be provided with housing. You know, Polish schools don't have 1 million spare seats. Many of them are traumatized and unwell. So this is a strain on the Polish health service. We are showing our solidarity, but we also need some solidarity from other European countries.
Rodek Sikorski there speaking to Ben Brown a little earlier. Well, more than 3.5 million people have left Ukraine since the war began, and millions more have been uprooted from their homes, as we keep hearing. For many, it is the country's trains that have delivered them from terrifying conditions over to safety. Well, our special correspondent Fergal Keane, along with camera journalist Nick Millard, have been travelling with some of the railway workers, and their report begins in the city of Lviv.
It's the sound of reassurance in a world of chaos. The Rescue Express, rolling through the night and the day from Lviv to the war zones of the east and back.
Keeping these trains running on time as they do takes the work of so many people at all different levels on the railways. Without them, it simply wouldn't have been possible to evacuate millions of people from the danger zone.
Many are railway veterans who started work in Soviet times and are now rescuing people from their own hometowns.
It is really terrifying. I'm from Kharkiv, and my native city is being bombed. I can feel it and I can see it, but I cannot believe it.
This is what people are fleeing. Home is no longer safe. The war has displaced over 10 million and sent many fleeing onto trains heading west. Dawn and arrival at Kyiv. The Krivospitska family are heading to Lviv.
My heart is bleeding. I don't want to leave my home, but it's my duty to keep my children safe. When we will win the war, I'll take them back home.
Grandad Oleg hugs his wife Olena, but he must stay behind to care for an elderly relative. The women carry the burdens of exile. The family reached Lviv 8 hours later. But they've already caught another rescue train. West to peace and exile. Fergal Keane, BBC News, Lviv.
Well, the US and the EU have announced a major deal today on liquefied natural gas in an attempt to cut Europe's reliance on Russian energy. Russia currently supplies about 40% of the EU's gas needs. The deal will give the EU an additional 15 billion cubic metres, equivalent to around 10% of the gas that it currently gets from Russia by the end of the year. One big energy provider that says it too will increase its gas production to help the world cope with less supplies from Russia is Canada. Its Natural Resources Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, spoke to my colleague Aaron Heselhurst, who started by asking if there was a consensus amongst energy ministers around the world about weaning themselves off Russian energy.
I think there is a consensus. I think the only differences are around how fast can you actually get away from it. I think everybody is committed to doing that, and many of us are committing to trying to help as much as we can in terms of displacing Russian oil and gas. But I think there was also a consensus about the need to advance the energy transition and to really focus on driving renewables and hydrogen.
Let's talk about your country, Canada.
fourth biggest oil producer on the planet. So, Minister, can you and are you going to, well, help the world be less dependent on Russian energy?
We are, and we're going to do that in the short term, and we're also going to try to do that in the long term. We'll be increasing our production and flow through the pipelines of oil of about 300,000 barrels a day by the end of the year.
Extra.
In line with work the Americans are also doing and the Brazilians have also announced. We're also looking at the potential for a couple of smaller LNG facilities on the East Coast that might be able to supply some of the demand for natural gas. But it will be in the context of how do you transition to something more sustainable over time. So any LNG facility we would build in Canada would need to be capable of converting to hydrogen. It would need to use electric drive technology so you're not creating domestic emissions that are going to be difficult to reconcile with your climate agenda.
How do you pump out an extra 300,000 barrels when your pipes are full nearly?
They're not quite full, and that's the exercise we've gone through with the producers, the pipeline companies, and the provinces. We are a federation in Canada. To try to identify how much capacity was there. And there's about 300,000 barrels per day of oil equivalent, 200,000 barrels of oil and 100,000 barrels of natural gas that we believe we can actually flow down to the United States. The United States has the takeaway capacity to be able to take that down to the Gulf Coast and either export it as crude or refine it and export it as finished products. But let me say that, the long-term answer is not significant increases in oil production. We all know that oil has to go down, consumption has to go down if we're going to meet our climate goals.
How quickly can you get this oil out?
Well, we will be ramping up over the course of the next few months. We expect that by the end of the year, we will be fully up to the 300,000 barrels.
That was Jonathan Wilkinson, the Natural Resources Minister of Canada, speaking to Aaron Hesselhurst. Well, the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine are being felt across the food industry too. Britain's biggest dairy company, Arla, says the cost of producing milk is increasing like never before. Arla is a cooperative with more than 2,000 UK dairy farmers. Its managing director, Ash Amir Ahmadi, is warning that unless its farmers are paid more, milk supplies could be under threat. He's been talking to our business correspondent, Emma Simpson, who began by asking him about the cost increases being seen now.
On-farm costs have been rising since last summer, feed, fertiliser and fuel, and we've been paying our farmers more money to cover that. Unfortunately, the cost of the farming has increased so much because of the Ukraine crisis that the cash flow on farm is negative and farmers as a result are producing less milk.
Are farmers breaking even?
Farmers are not making money at the moment and they're having to make some very important decisions on how much feed they buy, how much fertiliser they buy to grow the feed for the future.
How big is this drop in production then?
So UK dairy farmers have been growing production, producing more for about the last 7 to 8 years. But in the last 6 months, that has gone the other way. In February, farmers produced 2% less. And in March, it's 4% less. So the direction of travel is going the wrong way.
So what are the implications of that then? A shortfall of milk?
What we need to do is we need to make sure that farmers' costs are covered, but we also need to make sure that we're giving farmers the confidence to invest in continuing to produce milk and avoid any chance of any shortfall of the flow of milk.
There could be a chance of a shortfall then?
I think that is exactly what we're trying to avoid and the clear message that we're giving to our customers.
What are you saying here, that supermarkets will have to pay more so that farmers can recover their costs?
We're working with our customers who have helped us all through the previous resilience challenges and working with them to ensure that we put our arm around our farmers and pay our farmers more to cover their costs to make sure the milk is flowing.
Ash Amir Ahmadi, Managing Director of Arla, a milk cooperative. Let me just bring you a couple of lines coming into us being reported by the news agencies. We can't confirm them, but they are saying that the Ukrainian Air Force say that Russian missiles have targeted its command in the Vinnytsia area. Reuters saying that missiles have hit several buildings, causing significant damage to infrastructure, but the consequences are still being assessed there. And AFP also saying that Kiev saying that Russia strike has hit the military command centre or a military command centre in central Ukraine. Well, we've also been hearing that it's been reported that the Russians are saying they're going to focus their operations on the east of Ukraine. A number of different interpretations as to that, whether it is Russia pulling back a bit or whether it's them trying to consolidate in certain areas and separate some of the Ukrainian forces off. But I think we can bring you part of an interview from one of the Russian military leaders. Let's see if we can just play that in for you.
The main objectives of the first stage of the operation have generally been accomplished. The combat potential of Ukraine's armed forces have been considerably reduced, which makes it possible, I emphasise, to focus our core efforts on achieving the main goal, the liberation of Donbass.
Well, that was Colonel General Sergei Rudzkoy from the Russian Ministry of Defence. Let's have a look at some of the other news briefly from around the world today. And COVID-19 infections are continuing to rise across England, Scotland and Wales, although there's been a small decrease in Northern Ireland. New figures from the Office for National Statistics suggest that 1 in 16 people in England and Wales have COVID. In Scotland, it's as high as 1 in 11. Well, our medical editor, Fergus Walsh, told us more.
No sign of this COVID wave abating yet. Last week, it was estimated 4.3 million people almost had COVID across the UK. That's up 1 million in 1 week and a near record number. 1 in 16 in England and Wales, 1 in 11 in Scotland, down slightly in Northern Ireland, 1 in 17. Now, it's being driven by this more infectious subvariant of Omicron, BA2, plus the lifting of restrictions, less working from home, so more chances for the virus to spread and infect people. Most people will have a mild illness, but the numbers in hospital are going up too. Around 17,000 COVID patients now in hospital, although around half or slightly more than half of those will have been admitted with something else. Fortunately, the numbers in intensive care remain low, just about 300 COVID patients on ventilators. That's testament to treatments, but also to the vaccines. And of course, we've got more than 7 million people now eligible for this spring COVID booster.
Fergus Walsh there, our medical editor, on the rising COVID cases across the UK that we're seeing. Some more breaking news in the last hour. Houthi rebels in Yemen have launched a series of drone and rocket attacks on Saudi Arabia. Reports from the city of Jeddah say that an oil facility has been hit. This video posted on social media shows flames and this huge plume of black smoke billowing from the site. Saudi Arabia says its air defences destroyed 9 drones carrying explosives. Well, Formula One is awaiting news that the authorities have with fire just 12 miles from the Jeddah circuit as drivers practiced ahead of this weekend's race. Let me just show you President Biden, who is just arriving in Warsaw in the Polish capital. He has just gone into the car there. That's his team just following on behind him from Air Force One, which just, of course, was on the border with Ukraine on the Polish side, of course. But the US president, having made that very significant visit, talking to troops, being met by the Polish president, Mr. Duda, has now gone to Warsaw, where we understand that further talks will continue. Poland, of course, has taken the vast majority of refugees and people fleeing Ukraine. We're also hearing on the diplomatic front that the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, has spoken to the Turkish President, Mr. Erdogan, about the results of that NATO summit that we've seen and the threat of a food supply crisis. That's being reported by the news agencies. And we're also seeing reports that the Ukrainian Foreign Minister pushed back at Turkish media reports, citing President Erdogan that there had been progress in talks between Ukraine and Russia. So it's really not clear whether the negotiations are making any real progress, but at least those lines of communication are still open. We've also heard reports that the Ukrainian Air Force has suffered a strike, but it's not clear the extent of the damage in central Ukraine. And a Russian general, a Russian leader, military leader, has said that they are focusing their operations in the east of Ukraine, in the Donbass area at present. There's much more coming up for you in a few minutes. This is BBC News. I'm Geeta Gauramoorthy. Thanks for being with us.
When you know something important is happening, you want to be in there, to be part of it. At FT Live events, new ideas and valuable insights are shared by the world's leading minds, online and in person. Make sure you're there with them to shape the agenda with the right people in the right place at the right time.
Hello, I'm Ross Atkins with Outside Source. This is the extraordinary story of climate change. Vaccines, Europe, the Taliban, China. There is an awful lot to consider. Let's take this stage by stage. Here's the BBC's Stephen McDonald in Beijing. So help me understand the politics of this. Let's look at some of the international reaction. Tell us what you've been hearing. In practical terms, what does that mean? Next, we have to step back and let's just remind ourselves this is all part of the same story.
Piece the story together with Ross Atkins. Outside Source on BBC World News.
Hello there. The temperatures have been well above the seasonal norm across much of California and the Great Basin. Widespread sunshine, interior winds here, though not quite as hot as it has been as we head on into the weekend. Still dry and sunny, mind you. The eastern side of the United States, southeast Canada, also seeing a slight improvement for a while, but this colder air will be sinking southeastwards. And in that, there'll be some showers of a wintry element as it will be cold through central Canada and across much of the northeast corner of North America. This area of low pressure has brought all sorts of problems to parts of Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. Heavy rain and thunderstorms slowly pulling away during the weekend, so conditions will improve with increasing amounts of sunshine. There's a lot of sunshine across Europe thanks to high pressure. It's turning much colder, wetter and windier across Scandinavia and to the Baltic states. This area of low pressure, which has brought the dust and the heavy rain to Spain, slowly weakening as it pushes its way eastwards towards Italy over the weekend. This area of low pressure, which also brought the wet weather to Morocco and Algeria, as it pulls away, we'll see increasing amounts of sunshine there, so improvements for both Saturday and Sunday there. The Middle East will be dry, settled and sunny. Fairly strong winds around the Gulf. This shamal will lift some dust at times, but for the Levant region, after all the wet, cold weather, it's much brighter for both Saturday and Sunday. South Asia, a lot of dry and settled weather, turning hotter across northern India. Still the chance of a few showers breaking out across the Western Ghats and into Sri Lanka. The wet, windy weather will clear away from Japan thanks to this active weather front. Behind it, something a bit fresher but brighter with some sunshine for northeast China, the Korean Peninsula and eventually Japan as we move through Sunday. Some wet weather is in the forecast for New South Wales and also Queensland. Very bad news here after all the recent flooding which we've had. And this vigorous area of low pressure continues to bring some thundery downpours to the northeast of New Zealand. Elsewhere, it'll be fine and settled.
Join Simon Sebag Montefiore as he discovers the rise of one of the great cities of the world.
Vienna, dynastic city, city of art and music.
A metropolis with an imperial past. And a wealth of cultures, religions and ideas.
It all happened here in Vienna, the world city.
Vienna, Empire, Dynasty and Dream on BBC World News.
Today at 6, Russia signals a shift in its military strategy in the war here as Ukrainian troops successfully counterattack around the capital, Kyiv. Destroyed Russian tanks on the road north of the capital as fighting rages on the toll it's taking.
And Ukrainian troops have been able to achieve this against a much larger army, a more powerful army. In places now, they're not just resisting, they are mounting a counterattack.
Fears of starvation in the besieged city of Mariupol as hundreds queue for food and water. President Biden visits Poland to show support for Ukraine's neighbour and announces a deal on gas to reduce European reliance on Russian energy.
And the other main stories on the programme. New COVID cases reach record levels in Scotland with over 1 million infections across the UK in a week. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge on the last leg of a Caribbean tour that's attracted crowds and some controversy. And we meet the deaf actor Troy Kotsur, tipped for Oscar success this weekend as he returns to the deaf school inspired by his Hollywood debut.
And coming up on the BBC News Channel, Bale puts Wales on the brink of World Cup qualification, but has strong words for the Spanish media after that destructive performance against Austria.
Hello, good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. We're live in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv. Well, as the war in this country enters its second month, there are signs tonight of a possible shift in Russia's military aims. Commanders in Moscow are suggesting they may now focus their campaign on the east of the country. It comes as Ukrainian forces have succeeded in driving back Russian troops on a number of fronts. According to the latest British military intelligence, the Ukrainians have reoccupied towns and defensive positions 20 miles east of the capital, Kyiv, while Russian supply lines in that area are said to be overstretched. Our international correspondent, Ola Guerin, reports now from the front line on the outskirts of Kyiv.
On the northern outskirts of Kyiv, the burnt-out evidence of Russia's defeat, at least for now, on this front line. Ukrainian troops say Russian forces tried to get through here 4 times this month and were stopped in their tracks. It's a Grad rocket, says Salim, the commander, showing us what landed overnight. He takes pride in what his men from the 72nd Mechanised Brigade have done against